So this video is more like the history of the national debt and how these numbers are
And sovereign debt from AAA to AA1. Standard & Poor's had gone first in 2011.
So I don't know if you are aware, but this was actually the recently last year that the U.S. like the whole U.S. credit market got degrade. Were you aware of that? Okay.
Fitch followed in 2003,
the Moody
and
downgrade,
Moody's had completed
I
the
think
sweep in
people overlooked that.
2025. All three agencies, for the first time in American history, now consider the United States a slightly riskier bet than the gold standard it had held for more than a century. The statement Moody's released ran 3 paragraphs. Successive administrations and Congress, it read, had failed to agree on measures to reverse the trend of large annual fiscal deficits and growing interest costs. The agency did not say
Well,
a crash
it's
was
not
coming, but it
below
did
us.
say
It's just the
something
first
that
time that
suggested
all 3
worse.
credit
People responsible
agencies
for
downgraded
fixing this had
the US
repeatedly
debt.
chosen not to. The American national debt crossed $39 trillion in March 2026. That number grows by roughly $6 billion every single day, just from the spending Congress already approved, the tax cuts already written into law, and the interest accumulating on everything borrowed before today. The federal government spent $7 trillion in fiscal year 2025 and collected $5.2 trillion. The $1.8 trillion gap came from debt. Interest payments on that debt hit $970 billion in fiscal year 2025. Nearly $1 trillion paid in a single year simply to hold the existing balance in place. That figure surpassed the entire defense budget, $874 billion for the first
What's
time.
scary
in
is how
American
much
history.
interest
The
we're
country that
paying
spends more on its
on the
military
debt.
than the next 10 nations combined now pays more in interest on old credit card debt than it does to field an army, a navy, an air force, a nuclear arsenal.
But I don't know if you are aware about this. Just think about it, we're paying more and just holding our debt. We pay more than our debt than what the next 10 countries combined pay on national defense. Because now it's higher, now the expense is higher than national defense.
And every special operations force on the planet. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest bill reaches $2.1 trillion annually by 2036, and by 2055, interest payments consume 5.4% of the entire economy and 28 cents of every single dollar the federal government collects in taxes. The Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund runs out of
So he's just explaining all the different numbers, what that actually means. Because people, like we had discussed yesterday, people have a hard time comprehending large numbers. And I think this was outlined in the video. Basically, the 39 trillion debt is basically every United States citizen owns like $240,000. That's how much everyone partakes in that debt. To the same.
reserves in 2033. Under current law, the moment those reserves hit zero, benefits fall by 23% automatically for all 70 million recipients at once. A median income retiree loses roughly $18,000 per year from that cut alone. The 2023 Social Security Trustees Report determined that every year Congress delays fixing this problem, the eventual required adjustment grows 35% larger. The window to act cheaply closed years ago, but the window to act at all is narrowing. All three major credit agencies have now downgraded the
When you put that way, it's on there.
United States. The interest bill accelerates every year. The trust fund clocks tick down. The politicians who could address any of this keep choosing not to. And it's not a future problem.
Yeah,
it's barely
it's
even
likely
a distant.
inconvenient
The
to
reckoning has
say,
honestly
oh, we
already
have to raise
started, and
taxes,
most
so maybe
Americans
it's
have
more.
no idea how the country arrived here, how deeply the whole actually runs, or what happens if the bill finally comes due. So that's this story, the story of the American national debt. The United States carried debt since the first moment it existed as a nation. By 1791, the Revolutionary War had left the Republic with approximately $75 million in obligations, money owed to France, the Netherlands, and the domestic investors who had financed the fight for independence. The question of what to do with that debt split the country into two philosophical camps that have never fully reconciled, and the tension between them explains most of what has happened in the 2.5 centuries since. Alexander Hamilton, America's first Treasury Secretary, looked at $75 million of debt and saw a tool. He proposed that the new federal government assume all the individual states' war debts as well, roughly $21.5 million in additional obligations, and pay every creditor back in full at face value. His reasoning was strategic. You see, national debt, properly managed, signaled creditworthiness. It created a class of wealthy citizens and a direct financial interest in the federal government's survival. Hamilton described debt as the price of liberty and built his entire economic vision around the idea that a nation's ability to borrow cheaply was a form of sovereign power. This plan nearly tore the Republic apart before it had even finished forming. See, southern states, Virginia especially, had largely paid their own war debts and had no appetite for subsidizing the unpaid obligations of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Thomas Jefferson opposed the entire scheme on principle, arguing that federal debt transferred power from citizens.
And you already have us just like terms of learn from America's.
To banking elites and amounted to financial servitude imposed on future generations who had no say in acquiring it. The deal that
goes
broke
into
the
that.
deadlock happened
You'll
over a
see.
dinner at Jefferson's residence
some
on
interesting
Maiden
history
Lake
about
in New York
that.
City. Virginia agreed to debt assumption. In exchange, the permanent American capital would be built on the Potomac River. The Compromise of 1790, negotiated over one meal between three men, created both the American national credit system and Washington, D.C. And Hamilton's gamble paid off quickly. By 1792, American government bonds traded at $1.20 on the dollar, a premium that reflected genuine investor confidence in the new nation's ability to honor its word. Jefferson, who had fought the scheme at every turn, later relied on that same creditworthiness to finance the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's territory with borrowed money. The opposing philosophy, the deep moral conviction that debt was poison, never disappeared though. It found its fullest expression in Andrew Jackson. Jackson had lost money in a failed land speculation in his younger years and spent the rest of his life nursing a personal grudge against debt, banks, and the financial establishment he blamed for it. He viewed the national debt as the way a fire and brimstone preacher viewed sin, something to be eliminated at any cost through any means by whatever sacrifice was necessary. Jackson vetoed the renewal of the Second Bank of the United States, dismantled the institution he called the money power, and directed every budget surplus from land sales and tariff revenues toward paying down the principal year by year. On January 1st, 1835, Jackson achieved something no major government in history had accomplished before, and none has managed since. The national debt of the United States reached exactly zero. A celebratory dinner took place in Washington. Senators gave speeches. The Republic, for one brief and remarkable moment, owed nothing to anyone. That moment lasted less than 2 years. The surplus revenue Jackson had accumulated poured into states' banks across the country, which lent it at reckless speed into a land speculation bubble had helped inflate. The bubble burst.
If only they let them want more responsibilities, lots of speculative.
In 1837, half the nation's banks failed within months. A depression gripped the economy for 6 years. The debt returned almost immediately and has never left. This episode has haunted fiscal theorists ever.
If they learned from that lesson, we would never have the 2008 problems, right? It's just proving itself. Isn't that amazing?
because it taught a lesson that cuts against both Hamilton and Jackson. Government bonds function as a critical anchor for the entire financial system, and removing that anchor produces consequences that neither debtors nor creditors can fully predict or control. So the pattern that set in after 1837 has never fundamentally changed. Debt rises during emergencies and crises, retreats modestly during peacetime booms, but never falls all the way back to where it started. Each baseline is higher than the one before. Then came the Civil War, which rewrote the entire scale of federal borrowing entirely. The national debt stood at $55 million in 1860. By 1866, it had reached $2.7 billion, a 4,000% increase in 6 years. The Union financed the conflict through three simultaneous mechanisms: bonds marketed to ordinary citizens by financier J. Cook, who raised hundreds of millions through a network of agents that reached into nearly every American town, approximately $450 million in greenbacks, the first national paper currency the country had ever issued, and a brand new federal income tax that permanently altered the relationship between citizens and the federal government. The Confederacy, lacking a functional credit system and unwilling to impose the tax burden that sustained the Union's finances, printed currency without discipline and suffered inflation so catastrophic it destroyed the South's economic foundation before a single battlefield defeat sealed the political one. Over the 47 years that followed, the federal government ran 36 budget surpluses against just 11 deficits and drove the debt to gross domestic product ratio from roughly 30% back toward 3% by 1913. Then the 20th century arrived, and with it, its wars. World War I pushed the debt from $2.9 billion to $25.5 billion. The government sold 5 consecutive Liberty Bond drives through campaigns aggressive enough to reach at least 1/3 of all American adults. The Harding and Coolidge administrations ran 11 consecutive surpluses through the 1920s and retired 36% of that war debt before the Depression hit. And then World War II created the debt mountain that defines the modern era. By 1946, the national debt stood at $260 billion, which was 106% of gross domestic product, the highest ratio in American history at that point. Then something happened that almost every politician who invokes the post-war economic miracle chooses to misrepresent, because the true explanation is inconvenient for both political parties. From 1946 to 1974, over 28 years, the United States reduced its debt to gross domestic product ratio from 106% to just 23%. The ratio fell 83 percentage points over 3 decades, and the question of how it happened matters enormously today, because everyone currently in Washington claims the post-war story as evidence for their preferred policy. A definitive 2024 International Monetary Fund study decomposed exactly how much credit each factor deserves. Economic growth alone, the mechanism that every modern politician claims will solve the debt problem, would have reduced the ratio to roughly 74%, not 23%. Strong as the post-war boom was,
Okay, I think I need to pause it there to go through the numbers. Basically, he's explaining that politicians like to emphasize their single factor on what caused the decrease to promote their policy, when that single factor is not the case. It's a combination of things. And for this specific one, he's saying productivity was the reason it was able to reduce that ratio, and that's only one's actually a small part of it. If that makes sense, I'll continue going. If you have more questions than that, that's your name. Hi, Sanya. Thank you for coming. We're discussing natural debt and explaining it. Okay, just make sure you understand those fine
it could
details.
not
before we go on, because I know he used a lot of numbers quickly, and I'm just making sure it's easier to
close the gap
understand.
on its own. The remaining 51 percentage points came from two other sources. Primary budget surpluses, meaning the government actually spent less than it collected in taxes for extended periods.
So, people don't like discussing how they actually had a budget surplus, because that actually means cutting benefits and raising taxes pretty much.
Periods and financial repression, the policy of holding interest rates artificially below the inflation rate. And you need to understand financial repression because it is the mechanism that most likely determines how today's debt story ends. Between 1940
I don't think people in the modern day really truly understand this concept, because people are so used to having some kind of money saving mechanism. Oh, if I'm investing, I should get my money should be bigger at the time. But with this, that wasn't the case. So you might have gotten like 2% on your bond or whatever, but inflation was 6% or something. So you actually purchasing power actually decreased holding these bonds. And that difference is what allowed them to help to make that surplus.
and 1951, the Federal Reserve pegged Treasury bills at 0.3% and capped long-term bond yields at 2.5% regardless of what inflation did. Consumer prices rose at roughly 6.5% annually from 1946 to 1951. A bondholder earning 2.5% while inflation ran at 6.5% lost purchasing power every single year. The government borrowed money and paid it back in dollars worth less than the dollars it had borrowed. Savers absorbed the cost without most of them fully understanding what was happening to their savings. The debt problem dissolved because the people who had lent the government money quietly subsidized its repayment through inflation. The post-war miracle wasn't actually a miracle. It was a fiscal strategy that required sustained spending discipline, suppressed interest rates, favorable demographics from the baby boom, and a generation of savers who bore the hidden costs of financial repression without complaint. Replicating any single piece of that today,
One globalization has overtaken the whole thing. Since President Franklin D. Roosevelt called in 1940 the United States to serve as the arsenal of democracy, American industry had stepped up to meet the challenge of U.S. factories mass-produced automobiles have retooled to turn out airplanes, engines, guns, and other supplies at unprecedented rates. At the peak of this war effort, in the late 1943 and early 1944, the United States manufacturing almost as many munitions as all of its allies and enemies combined.
difficult. Replicating all four simultaneously is honestly not a realistic planning assumption. The post-war fiscal consensus cracked under Lyndon Johnson's guns and butter strategy, simultaneously escalating Vietnam at an eventual cost exceeding $1 trillion in today's money while launching the Great Society programs that created Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. Johnson's own Council of Economic Advisors warned him that a tax increase was necessary to prevent inflation, but Johnson refused, fearing Congress would gut his domestic programs if the two were linked. The inflation that followed, climbing from 1.6% in 1965 to 5.8% by 1969, took 15 years to fully
With reduced spending,
and
we
then
need to
Ronald
both
Reagan
and
entered
reduce
office
spending.
in 1981, promising three
That's
things: cut
inconvenient.
taxes, increase defense spending, and balance the budget. He only kept two of the three. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1881 cut the top marginal income tax rate from 70% to 50%, and eventually
Remember how I was talking about this concept earlier about pay close attention when the wealth gap really exploded, 1980s? Yeah, this is a good factor in that. It's not the complete factor,
to
but yeah, it's a
28%
big
by
factor.
1986. Supply-side theory, known as Reaganomics, held that cutting tax rates would stimulate economic growth so powerfully that total tax revenues would increase and pay for the cuts. The Laffer curve, famously sketched on a napkin by economist Arthur Laffer for Ford administration officials Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld in 1974, illustrates the theoretical logic. At a tax rate of 0, the government collects nothing. At a tax rate of 100%, the government also collects nothing because nobody earns anything. Somewhere between those extremes lies the revenue maximizing rate, and that argument is that the top rate in the 1970s sat above it. The theory produced strong economic growth in the mid-1980s, but it didn't produce the promised flood of new revenue. Reagan's own budget director, David Stockman, admitted as much in a devastating 1981 interview with The Atlantic, describing supply-side economics as a Trojan horse to bring down the top rate, and confessing that none of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers. Combined with a massive...
See, even the administration promoting the idea, one of the guys involved in it, basically made it as a Trojan horse. Yeah. It's the... It amazes me to this day how people, even in the modern day, overlook facts like this. It's like, no, Reagan was the best. He did that thingy, the Reaganomics. So it's like, no, they even admitted it was a Trojan horse.
Cold War defense buildup, the national debt tripled during Reagan's 2 terms from $994 billion to $2.9 trillion. The debt to gross domestic product ratio climbed from 26% to 41%. The defense of Reagan is that the Cold War required military investment the Soviet Union could not match, that winning the confrontation without firing a single shot was worth the fiscal cost, and that strong economic growth through the decade validated the demand-side effects of the tax cuts even if the revenue effects were overstated. But the counter-argument is that the government simply transferred the cost to future generations through borrowing. But what followed Reagan was a brief and extraordinary reversal. Bill Clinton took office in 1993 facing a unified deficit of $290 billion and a Congressional Budget Office projection so dire that his own advisors said the country was headed toward a fiscal crisis. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993, passed without a single Republican vote, raised the top income tax ratio to 39.6% and established pay-go rules requiring every new spending increase to carry an offset. The Republican Congress that arrived in 1994 enforced spending caps more rigorously than their predecessors had. The Cold War's end allowed defense spending to fall by nearly $100 billion from its 1980s peak. The dot-com technology boom flooded the Treasury with unexpected capital gains tax revenue that no budget model had anticipated. By 2000, the United States ran a budget surplus of $236 billion, the largest in American history. In January 2001, the Congressional Budget Office projected $5.6 trillion in cumulative surpluses over the coming decade, enough to pay off all publicly held debt by 2012. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan testified before Congress that he worried about what monetary policy would look like without Treasury securities to purchase because the national debt might simply disappear. But that projection evaporated completely in roughly 3 years. George W. Bush's 2001 and 2003 tax cuts cost roughly $1.6 trillion in foregone revenue over the first decade. Brown University's Cost of War project later estimated the Iraq and Afghanistan wars at roughly $8 trillion combined, including long-term veteran care and interest costs. An unfunded prescription drug benefit added to Medicare in 2003 ran over $530 billion in its first decade alone. Federal revenues plunged from 20% of gross domestic product to 14.5%. And then the 2008 financial crisis produced a deficit of $1.4 trillion in fiscal year 2009, the largest peacetime deficit in American history at that point. Barack Obama inherited that crisis, with deficits already exceeding $1 trillion before he signed a single piece of legislation. His administration reduced the annual deficit from $1.4 trillion to $585 billion over 8 years through economic recovery, the 2011 Budget Controls Act spending caps, helped by a Republican Congress, and a 2013 fiscal deal with Republicans that restored some pre-Bush tax rates. But the national debt still rose from $10 trillion to $19.9 trillion over those 8 years, driven by the recession, the baseline from 2 unfunded wars that he continued, and a stimulus program program his advisors believed saved the country from a second Great Depression. Then came the current president, Donald Trump, in his first term. That's where he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. The Congressional Budget Office scored the law as adding $1.9 trillion in deficits over a decade. Pre-COVID deficits climbed from $585 billion to $984 billion annually, making the late 2010s the first sustained peacetime expansion in America.
So, one party's talk about doing last taxes to the rich, including like Reagan and Trump. That's why we have a bunch of tax cuts. Where is it? Can I get a line here? No, I'm lying. So their argument is we're right here. So we reduce taxes, so they bring it back, over here. That's why the argument to less taxes. Like in reality, we're like here, and they're pushing it here. Like we need to raise taxes. Come on now.
In history to produce annual deficits approaching $1 trillion. Of course, then came the pandemic. The federal government spent approximately $6.6 trillion in COVID-19 relief from 2020 and 2021 across legislation signed by two presidents of different political parties. Are you starting to get the picture yet? Neither political party cares. Either way, the fiscal year 2020 deficit reached $3.1 trillion, 14.7% of gross domestic product. And the national debt jumped from $23 trillion to $28 trillion in just 2 years. The Federal Reserve, to prevent economic collapse, drove interest rates to near zero and purchased enormous quantities of treasury bonds.
People don't want to pay more taxes. And the funny thing is, people are paying taxes in direct ways, like Trump tariffs, provoking inflation. With food rising, those rising costs to inflation, that's technically counted as tax. But people are okay with passive taxes more than direct taxes. People in general need a better fundamental understanding of indirect taxes. It's the same thing as complaining about with tips. They're like, oh, this food's $20, not $50, but they overlook that they're paying a 20% tip to get their food at $40, not $50, and they're paying more because of the tip system anyways. So it's stupid.
To hold long-term yields down. The government refinanced its existing debt rates, approaching 0.65% on the 10-year treasury. If you put your head back in that year, it looked like sound crisis management at the time. The problem, of course, has always arrived afterward. The Federal Reserve then raised rates aggressively when inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022. The 10-year Treasury yield climbed from 0.65% in August 2020 to 4.6% by 2023. Every piece of debt the government had issued at a historic low then had to be rolled over at the new, higher rates. The average interest rate paid across the entire federal debt more than doubled from 1.56% in January 2022 to 3.38% by mid-2025. The consequence showed up directly in the federal budget as nearly $1 trillion in annual interest payments, and it explains more about the current fiscal trajectory than any single spending program or tax cuts. Joe Biden's term added roughly $7 trillion in debt across the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act against a backdrop of inherited pandemic deficits. On July 4th, 2025, Donald Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The Congressional Budget Office scored it at 3.
And this is the big thing that I've been criticizing for a while now. This big, beautiful bill to reduce taxes on the rich. We're paying $3.4 trillion without a crisis. It's so infuriating. This is different than buying money for a name, or buying money for COVID, buying money to prevent a total collapse in the economic system like 2008. There's no reason for this $3.4 trillion deficit other than to just boots of rich people.
$0.4 trillion in added primary deficits over the 2025 to 2034 window, with interest costs pushing the total fiscal impact to $4.1 trillion. The law simultaneously raised the deficit ceiling by $5 trillion. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, had previously briefed House Republicans just months earlier, urging them to bring deficits to 3% of gross domestic product and warning that the trajectory could trigger the fiscal death spiral he had spent years studying. But Congress passed the bill anyway, and 2 weeks after the House vote, 30-year Treasury yields closed above 5% for the first time in years. Clearly, no political party cares about actually cutting the programs that are costing taxpayers trillions of dollars, or cutting the fraud that is draining the current tax revenues from spending properly, or increasing the tax revenues to offset how much more we spend. So the best thing you can do is honestly take care of your own personal finances. And that's what tens of thousands of active...
So, this is what I'm doing right now, was saying to start trading and trying to get something to do with my money to earn an income, because there's no long-term sustainability with rely on the government, because I get mine through disability and I don't work, and there's no guarantee that I will continue to get disability, so I do my best what I can with it while I still have it. And there's another thing about my investing I didn't explain. Remember how you talked about the balance? This goes in. This is actually, I think this is actually brilliant on my part, because ideally you would start something like that again, where you release bonds at interest rate lower than inflation rate, right? So you end up, say your purchasing power actually decreases holding bonds. But the thing is, I actually buy something called an I-bond every year. And what I-bond is, it has a fixed interest rate. So right when you buy it, say it's on like 1 or 2% right when you buy it, that fixed interest rate lasts throughout the bond's lifetime. That can never change. And that's added on the inflation rate. So you get the change inflation rate every like 6 months or something. They recalculate every 6 months and they combine the two rates together, and that's your total rate for the I-bond. And there's a limit of how much you can buy every year, and I try to keep that every year. And that's my hedge, right, against everything. Trying to buy those I-bond.
Monthly users are doing with the DollarWise budgeting app. It automatically connects to your accounts, surfaces insights that actually change your behavior, and makes the process of understanding money something people actually stick with, unlike other budgeting apps. There's a 3-day free trial, so you can download it and try it without any commitment and see if it actually works for you. Download the app in your app store of choice, or just click that link below or go to dollarwise.com. Change your life and your money, because the federal government certainly isn't going to. That's because every dollar in new deficit spending adds to an interest burden that already broke through $970 billion in 2025. To understand why that number matters more than any other figure in the entire federal budget, it requires a specific kind of attention that I'm going to deliver to you right now. You see, the federal government currently operates what economists call a primary deficit. Even before counting a single dollar of interest, it spends roughly 2.1% of gross domestic product more than it collects in taxes. The hole exists before interest is added. Interest then compounds on top of it through a self-reinforcing feedback.
So you can go to this website and it'll tell you what the current rate is. So the fixed rate is 0.9%, and the inflation rate's the rest of it, and the total rate right now for Taiwan is 4.26%. And this is for Taiwan's issue from May 1st, 2026 to October 31st, 2026. So, if you buy Taiwan now, that's your interest rate.
Loop that operates automatically regardless of what politicians say or do. More debt requires more treasury bonds to fund it. More bonds push yields higher to attract buyers. Higher yields increase the cost of refinancing existing debt. Higher refinancing costs expand the deficit, and a larger deficit demands still more bonds.
So my Taiwans have different interest rates because I bought them at each different year, and that has a different fixed rate each on each one.
On previous borrowing. The Congressional Budget Office projects net interest payments reach $1.8 to $2.1 trillion
One of my
annually
Taiwans was
by
purchased during the rapid inflation during COVID, and that actually has a 0%
of gross domestic product. Around 2051, interest on the national debt overtakes Social Security as the single largest expenditure in the entire federal budget, surpassing every defense program, every healthcare program, and every social program the government funds. And you can see this with the 5-year trajectory. In fiscal year 2020, interest cost $345 billion. By 2025, it cost $970 billion. The interest bill nearly tripled in 5 years. The Congressional Budget Office projects it nearly doubles again by 2035.
But yeah, if you're purchasing Taiwan's during rapid inflation like during COVID, the fixed rate would be 0.
Driving all of it
so you gotta buy them now where it actually has a fixed rate to hedge against some big
can
towns.
legislate away. In 1950, the Social Security system operated on a worker to beneficiary ratio of 16.5 to 1. For every retiree collecting benefits, 16.5 working Americans paid payroll taxes into the system. A pay-as-you-go retirement structure functions sustainably at that ratio. Today, the ratio stands at approximately 2.8 workers per beneficiary.
Because you have no idea how the United States government's gonna handle their debt future. And whatever that
system was never designed to operate at those numbers, and no fiscal trick makes the arithmetic work without either reducing benefits, raising payroll taxes, or some combination of both. The Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund holds approximately $2.5 trillion in Treasury securities today. Those reserves accumulated during the decades when baby boomers were working.
Even when I bought my iPhone when it was 0% fixed, I still felt it was a good time because you get set limits how much you can buy every year. So I gained nothing from selling that I want to buy a new one, but there's a real limit per year anyways. So I would say anytime's a good time because it's a hedge against inflation. You get the inflation rate. So no regrets. But if you buy iPhone right now, that's the rate. There's this information.
And paying in more than the retiree population throughout. Baby boomer.
I'm pretty sure I think the iPhone I bought last year or this year has a better rate than the current rate. But yeah, I do have some 0% rate iPhones where those get less from the current.
Now retire at roughly $11,200 per day during the peak years of 2024 through 2027. By 2030, every single baby boomer will be 65 or older. At that point, the reserves drain. The Congressional Budget Office projects those reserves run out around 2033. Under current law, when the reserves hit 0, Social Security can only pay beneficiaries what ongoing payroll taxes support in that same month, approximately 77 cents on the dollar. That is an automatic across-the-board 23% cut in benefits affecting 70 million recipients simultaneously. A median income retiree loses roughly 18.
So basically my concentration is these iPhones that I've been talking about and Medicare sector. Because it's a big recession, big bubble, AI bubble, AI bubble verse or whatever. people are still gonna need medical, so that's what they were behind that.
$1,000 per year. This is mandated into law. And then Medicare faces an identical clock. The Hospital Insurance Trust Fund depletes around 2033. Hospital reimbursement payments fall by 11% automatically at that point. The 2023 Social...
Specifically, it's actually the biotech side of Medicare. It's not like the insurance part. It's specifically developing, like the COVID-19 vaccines. It's the biotech part. Hey, right. That I make that distinction. That's why I emphasize Pfizer and Moderna so much. That's the biotech side of
Security
medical.
Trustees report established that every single year Congress delays addressing this, the eventual required adjustment grows 35% larger. The 75-year unfunded liability of Social Security alone, the gap between what the program has promised and what the current tax structure can deliver, stands at approximately $28 trillion. That figure is roughly equal to the entire current publicly held national debt. And the unfunded liability of Medicare is larger still. The federal spending breakdown for fiscal year 2025 illustrates why none of this yields to simple solutions. Social Security consumed $1.463 trillion. Net interest costs $970 billion. Medicare costs $891 billion. Defense costs $874 billion. Medicaid costs $618 billion. Every other function of the federal government combined.
So he's going to like the pie chart of the federal spending. As you can see, Social Security is still the highest, but they project net interest even percent past that in like 2040 or something like that.
Meaning education, transportation, scientific research, veteran services, federal law enforcement, foreign aid, and everything else fits into the remaining share. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest together already consume 73% of all federal spending, and that share rises every single year. Economists
So on that number, he's specifically adding the interest rate, defense spending, and top three expenditures. What are you watching? We're watching a video by Caleb Phillips. He's talking about the national debt. I'm a very economic VTuber, so I like explaining these issues. So, on these numbers that he gave, he's just adding up the three expenditures and making a point that national defense, Medicare, Social Security, and the interest rate. Actually, did he leave up defense? Sorry.
federal law enforcement, foreign aid, and every...
Yeah, he just did Medicare, net interest, and Social Security. Yeah, these three together. And
else fits into the
explain how much
share.
spending
Social
those
Security,
three
Medicare,
items are.
Medicaid, and interest together already consume 73% of all federal spending, and that share rises every single year. Economist Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University developed a framework called generational accounting to measure precisely how much of the fiscal burden falls on each birth cohort. Kotlikoff's work constantly shows that current policy forces future generations to pay taxes at dramatically higher rates relative to the benefits they receive than any previous American generation faced. The transfer of wealth from the future to the present happens not through any single law, but through compound interest operating automatically across decades. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink stated the general dimension plainly in 2025. The federal government has prioritized maintaining entitlement benefits for people my age, even though it might mean Social Security will struggle to meet its full obligations when younger workers retire. Government spending per senior citizen already runs approximately $37,000 per year. Government spending per child runs approximately $7,300. A 5-to-1 ratio, and as the population ages, that imbalance just gets worse and worse each decade. History provides several examples of what happens when sovereign debt grows faster than a government's capacity.
Hello, thank you for coming. We're watching our economics talk about Halloween. the national debt and how that affects the younger generations now.
Capacity to service it, and the lessons from those cases are more varied and more instructive than the standard collapse narrative suggests. Greece represents the starkest modern example of a debt crisis that played out in public view. In 2009, the Greek government quietly revealed that its actual budget deficit ran at 15.4% of gross domestic product, nearly double what Greek authorities had reported to European Union partners. The revelation triggered an immediate loss of investor confidence. Borrowing costs on two-year Greek bonds spiked from manageable levels to above 35% within 18 months. Three successive bailouts from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund totaled more than 300 billion euros, the largest sovereign rescue package in history at the time. The Troika, meaning the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, imposed conditions. Greece cut public sector wages, slashed pensions by up to 40%, raised taxes, and dismissed tens of thousands of government workers. Gross domestic product collapsed by 26% over 5 years, a contraction longer and deeper than the American Great Depression. Unemployment peaked at 27% nationally. Youth unemployment hit 55%. More than 427,000 Greeks emigrated, the majority of them university educated. The political consequences were severe. The Golden Dawn Neo-Fascist Party entered parliament for the first time, and the radical left-wing Syriza party took power as the economic crisis fed political extremism on both sides of the spectrum. So let's talk about the austerity paradox that destroyed Greece. It's important for you to understand because gross domestic product shrank faster than the debt to gross domestic product ratio actually worsened through the years of brutal cuts, rising from 127% to 180% despite austerity measures that gutted the Greek welfare state. The country bled for years.
Should I keep up with these numbers that he's turning out? He's talking about how what Greece went through. Might draw some parallels to the current United States situation. Thought I did real little break up all those numbers. Pfizer doing? Let's start with it. I don't know what happened here now. I'm just quite bounce now. Yeah. We still around? Are the numbers? No, they're not. They're not. Here's this I like nice. No, here's this time. Well, how let me start. So basically, things started out when okay, picture this. Say the United States saying how we have $59 trillion of debt, right? 29 that I just can't speak. We have $39 trillion of debt. Imagine the United States Secretary said, "Hey, we don't have $39 trillion of debt. We really have $69 trillion of debt." What would you think would happen? not directly. So mass pack them up the quick. Yeah. So what this end up doing for Greece? Their bonds were like at I don't know what he said. Hang on, I can line it. Like the bonds were like 5 was 15% or something. They went to like 35% after they announced that. It was really insane. So that's that's the numbers he's talking about.
Pensions by up to 40%, raised taxes, and dismissed tens of thousands of government workers. Gross domestic product collapsed by 26% over 5 years, a contraction longer and deeper than the American Great Depression. Unemployment peaked at 27% nationally. Youth unemployment hit 55%. More than 427,000 Greeks emigrated, the majority of them university educated. The political consequences were severe. The Golden Dawn nations to pay taxes at dramatically higher rates relative to the benefits they received than any previous American generation faced. The transfer of wealth from the future to the present happens not through any single law, but through compound interest operating automatically across decades. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink stated the general dimension plainly in 2025. The federal government has prioritized maintaining entitlement benefits for people my age, even though it might mean Social Security will struggle to meet its full obligations when younger workers retire. Government spending per senior citizen already runs approximately $37,000 per year. Government spending per child runs approximately $7,300. A 5-to-1 ratio. And as the population ages, that imbalance just gets worse and worse each decade. History provides several examples of what happens when sovereign debt grows faster than a government's capacity to service it. And the lessons from those cases.
So how they transfer to Greece is right tail is that's a historic example of what happens when debt runs faster than they can service it. Which is we're not there yet, but we're getting close.
More varied and more instructive than the standard collapse narrative suggests. Greece represents the starkest modern example of a debt crisis that played out in public view. In 2009, the Greek government quietly revealed that its actual budget deficit ran at 15.4% of gross domestic product, nearly double what Greek authorities.
So their ratio was nearly double. So the equivalent of that, to try to explain it a bit more, is basically saying, no, we don't have $39 trillion of debt. We actually have $59 trillion of debt. You know, the actual debt wasn't like that, but the way they ratio, that ratio can be manipulated by saying that you have less debt than you're claiming, like my example I showed, or saying, no, we don't have 39, we have 69 trillion dollars. That's one way to imbalance a ratio like that. The other way is to overplay your GDP numbers, like saying, your country is producing, say your government produced had a 5% increase compared to the previous year, well, it's only 1%. And you keep on doing like that. China does similar number manipulations with its population and stuff too. So it's not the only government that manipulates these numbers. So it's a question: is the U.S. government doing number manipulation? I think they are when it comes to given inflation rates. The real inflation rate, like the CPI. I think they have ways of manipulating that by including certain things and excluding certain things. So that's what he's talking about here. So that's what he's talking about here about that ratio double. That ratio double is basically more debt to your GDP than expected.
And union partners. The revelation triggered an immediate loss of investor confidence. Borrowing costs on 2-year Greek bonds spiked from manageable levels to above 35% within 18 months. 3 successive.
So imagine you have 5 or you know how our bonds are like 5% right now. Imagine that all of a sudden going 35% because the government said, oh no, we have $69 trillion of debt. It's because the investor confidence is so low, you have to give better interest rates to compensate for that. the reason why that works is actually indirectly. So say you have $100 bond. So they sell this bond for like $80. The other $20 is the actual interest rate. So you're buying a $100 bond for $80, and that difference is your interest rate. So imagine that $100 bond all of a sudden selling for like $40. That's the fact. That's where this comes from. Does that make sense now? Yeah. So basically, as actually worse in reality, they're underplaying the numbers. But does my bond explanation actually make sense now? I don't think people actually understand how bond interest rates work. That's why I explained it the way I did. It's kind of like Pfizer here. It's the similar concept to Pfizer here. So it's a static 43 cents per share. So when the Pfizer stock drops, so say if it goes to $21 a share, you're still getting 43 cents per share on the dividend yield. And because the stock itself is cheaper, you get more yield every year. That's the same example with the bonds were. So if you sell $100 bond for $80, that difference is your interest rate. But now people only buy them for $40. That raises the interest rate because that's the difference.
Bailouts from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund totaled more than 300 billion euros, the largest sovereign rescue package in history at the time. The Troika, meaning the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, imposed conditions. Greece cut public sector wages, slashed pensions by up to 40%, raised taxes, and dismissed tens of thousands of government workers. Gross domestic product collapsed by 26% over 5 years, a contraction longer and deeper than the American Great Depression. Unemployment peaked at 27% nationally. Youth unemployment hit 55%. More than 427,000 Greeks emigrated, the majority of them university educated. The political consequences were severe. The Golden Dawn neo-fascist party entered parliament for the first time, and the
So the effect was so bad after Revelation, you went through worse than the Great Depression flow for the Greece and took over.
radical left-wing Syriza party took power as the economic crisis fed political extremism on both sides of the spectrum. So let's talk about the austerity paradox that destroyed Greece. It's important for you to understand because gross domestic product shrank faster than the debt to gross domestic product ratio actually worsened through the years of brutal cuts, rising from 127% to 180% despite austerity measures that gutted the Greek welfare state.
So this is another thing. You can cut all you want, but if your GDP can't support your debt, and this ratio still goes higher. That's why it's an important metric to keep an eye on.
The country bled for years and ended up more indebted by the measure that matters most. But the critical difference between Greece and the United States is that Greece has surrendered its currency. Inside the Eurozone, Athens couldn't print drachmas, couldn't devaluate, couldn't use inflation to erode the real value of its debt. The full weight of adjustment fell on spending cuts and tax increases, the most economically painful and politically volatile form of fiscal correction. A sovereign nation controlling its own currency holds options that Greece never had. Argentina stands as history's serial defaulter, with 8 sovereign defaults in total. The 2001 crisis produced what was at the time the largest sovereign default in history, approximately $95 billion in obligations renounced at once. The Corralito, the emergency bank deposit freeze that prevented Argentine citizens from accessing their own savings, sparked riots that killed 39 people and produced 5 presidents in 2 weeks. The peso collapsed from a 1-to-1 peg against the dollar to 4-to-1 within days. Poverty exceeded 50% of the population. Hedge fund manager Paul Singer at Elliott Management purchased Argentina's defaulted bonds for approximately $49 million, spent over a decade litigating through international courts, and eventually extracted $6.5 billion, roughly 100 times the original investment. Then Argentina defaulted again in 2020. Germany's Weimar Republic provides the endpoint of a government that finances itself entirely through monetary creation. Burdened by World War I reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks, the Weimar government in 1923 printed marks to pay the wages of workers who had gone on strike during the French occupation of the Ruhr region. The exchange rate against the dollar went from 4.2 marks per dollar before the war to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar.
Think about this inflation. That's crazy. I was actually stunned hearing that.
Of the Ruhr region. The exchange rate against the dollar
It's only 4.2 marks for $1 before that. What the frit? That inflation's
went from
crazy.
4.2 marks per dollar before the war to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar.
4.2 to 4.2 trillion. That's insane.
By November 1923. Prices doubled every few days. A university student cup of coffee cost 5,000 marks when ordered and 8,000 marks when the cup was empty. The hyperinflation was halted through the introduction of the Rentenmark and the commitment of central banker Hjalmar Schacht to stop monetizing government debt entirely.
So think about this. During the COVID about the 9% inflation, and people still make a big deal about it. They're like, oh my god, Biden's a stupid president. There's 9% inflation on your hill. And it's like, yeah, imagine 100% inflation every 2 days. That's what Germany went through. That's nuts.
The devastation to German middle-class savings and institutional trust laid the psychological groundwork for what followed a decade later. Japan presents the counterexample that debt skeptics cite most frequently. Japan carries approximately 230% of gross domestic product in gross government debt, the highest ratio of any advanced economy in the world, and has carried extraordinary debt for 3 decades.
This is gonna break too. There's also something called the high exchange rate. I forget what it's called. Japan. I think it's called Japan exchange rate. Japan. I just want to make sure it's the right time. Carry trade, I'm sorry. It's called the carry trade. So what you do is you take a loan in Japanese yen because the rates are so low, and people are still in this trade despite the unwinding. I think it was by the debt last year, 2024. One seriously, and let me see how. But yeah, this is still um, going on because of the rising interest rates because of this issue. Do not have to do something to address this, and that's how I the carry trade, and that could affect global stock markets.
Without a sovereign crisis. 5 structural factors explain Japan's unusual position. Domestic investors, meaning Japanese citizens, banks, pension funds, and the Bank of Japan itself, hold roughly 90% of all Japanese government bonds. That captive domestic base does not flee during global volatility the way foreign creditors can. The Bank of Japan has practiced aggressive yield curve control. Purchasing bonds in whatever quantity keeps long-term interest rates near zero. Japan runs current account surpluses, making it a net creditor to the world. All Japanese debt is denominated in yen, preserving full monetary sovereignty. Japan's government financial assets reduce the net debt figure to approximately 78% of gross domestic product on a consolidated basis. Japan does not prove that debt levels are irrelevant. Japan has suffered 3 decades of near-zero economic growth, productivity trailing every other major advanced economy, and a demographic collapse so severe that its population has begun to shrink. Japan proves that a government with specific structural advantages, particularly captive domestic savings, and a central bank willing to buy unlimited quantities of government bonds, can sustain extraordinary debt levels for far longer than any theoretical model would predict. Japan does not prove that doing so is free. Japan's model now shows signs of fracturing under its own weight. In early 2000,
No, that's not a rumor at all. It's not a rumor at all. I can't remember if it's 2024 or 2025. There was actually a considerable dip in the market because some unwinding did happen because of this. And what happens with the carry trade is when these interest rates go up, some of the selling on the global stock market comes from meaning to pay out these loans, and some trades are set up through margin where you're forced to sell because of these rising rates, and that's why I think it's 2024, 2025. I don't remember what year, but there was like I said, there was a considerable dip in the market because of this carry trade issue. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure if I answered the exact thing that was asked. But yeah, the selling off, it actually did happen once. There's a considerable selling off because of it already. I could probably ask Crack real quick what the carry trade. Let's see. Tell me about the mass selling Let's see. The major event you're referring to is the August 2024 global yeah, I know it was there here. That's exactly what I was talking about. Yeah, Black knew exactly what I was talking about. Yeah, I'll post it in the chat. I'm deaf by my chat. So yeah, this actually did happen once already. There was a massive sell-off in August 2024 because of it. Let's see if we can actually see on the chart. It should be very distinct on the chart too. It's 2024, so it's a bit longer, so it might be a little harder to find, but let's see. 2024. Yeah, I definitely remember him. Didn't affect Pfizer at all. Not awesome, not much because it went lower here. Let me see the channel market. Games. Yes. See how it's right here? The next day is right here. Yeah, it did go up. It's right after that. But yeah, here on this. That's the carry trade saw. It's definitely not a limit. This big huge dip was from it. See? That is really big. This is not over a market we're talking about. See, it was right here, 475, went down to 457. That is not significant. There was a huge sell-off because of it. Are you able to see this chart? But yeah, this right here was just because of that very issue that you thought was wrong. It really did happen, and it caused a significant impact to the stock market itself was right because of carry trade when
2026, Japanese 40-year bond yields reached a record 4.2% as market participants began pushing back against 3 decades of suppressed rates. Ed Yardley, the market strategist who coined the term bond vigilantes in 1983, began to describe investors who sell government bonds to discipline profligate fiscal policy, noted in January 2026 that Japan's own market was issuing a direct warning signal to every heavily indebted government watching from abroad. And remember, one of the easiest ways to pay off debt is by actually bringing in more money. And one way someone can do that right now is literally signing up for a Chime checking account using my link below or at chime.com/Caleb. You see, the reason I say this,
I don't know about how I endorse this ad, but yeah, this is an ad for personal checking account.
is because if you sign up with my link and set up direct deposit, you literally get $350 for free. I get free money, you get free money, and then they get you to use their bank. And there's no downside to that either, because they have one of the nation's leading high yield savings rate. So literally get $350 for free, chime.com/Caleb, or link in the description below. The bond vigilante threat sits at the center of the most urgent crisis scenario for American debt, and the United Kingdom in September 2022 provided the clearest modern example of how quickly that scenario can materialize. Councillor Kwanzi Kwarteng announced £45 billion in unfunded tax cuts, a significant fiscal expansion with no identified funding mechanism. The bond market reacted within hours. Over
he does that
30-year
awesome.
gilt
That's very
yields spiked
confident of you.
120 basis points. Leveraged pension funds that had
I
borrowed
actually
against
find you
enormous
on it.
quantities of long-dated gilts at suppressed rates faced margin calls they could not meet. Forced selling created a cascade. Pension funds sold gilts to cover margin calls, pushing gilt prices lower, triggering more margin calls, forcing more selling. The Bank of England intervened with emergency bond purchases totaling nearly £20 billion to stop the.
This, like I said, this wasn't something on a lighter. It didn't get to this bad, obviously. But the reason why it went down so much that I showed you on the chart, because and carry trade aligning has to do with this concept to an extent, because the prices fell and it issued more for selling to cover the margin, and because those margin calls were cloud to selling, there's more selling because they triggered more margin calls. But according to, I did ask this question to Grok one time. are people still in the carry trade? And they're like, yeah, they end up re-entering. I'm like, okay. I hope they're not using margin for it, because this carry trade is gonna end completely soon. I hope people are risk off.
Cascade from destroying the pension system. Prime Minister Liz Truss reversed the tax cuts within 3 weeks and resigned after 45 days in office. A British tabloid placed the head of lettuce next to her photograph on day one and ran a countdown clock to see which would last longer. The lettuce won. James Carville, Bill Clinton's political strategist, described bond market power in a line that has been quoted at the highest levels of international finance for 3 decades. I used to think that if there's reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the president.
I think you're seeing more talk about it again because of them trying to raise interest rates again. So whenever Japan's raising interest rates, you're gonna see a lot of talk about the carry trade.
President or a .400 baseball hitter. But now I want to come back as the bond market. You can intimidate everybody. In April 2025, following American tariff announcements, 10-year Treasury yields spiked to 4.59% and 30-year yields hit multi-year highs. Ken Griffin, founder of Citadel, told the Davos audience in January 2026 that 5% on the 10-year Treasury represented the critical threshold, the level at which Treasury bonds begin competing directly with equity returns and lose their function as a risk-free safe haven in investor portfolios. Ray Dalio had previously briefed House Republicans in March of 2025, urging them to address the deficit before markets forced the issue. Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act 4 months later. The dollar's reserve currency status provides the United States with an
So now he's pulling back to the United States situation with the Big Beautiful Bill, and how the bond interest rates hovering near 5% is actually really scary. It's actually the canary in the coal mine, it's hard to speak when it's hovering at high.
advantage that economists call the exorbitant privilege, a term coined by a French finance minister in the 1960s to describe the structural discount the United States receives on its borrowing costs because global demand for dollars and dollar-denominated treasuries is built into the architecture of international trade and finance. Global trade is invoiced primarily in dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. Central banks around the world hold dollar-denominated assets as their primary reserves. That structural demand allows the United States to carry debt levels that would have caused borrowing costs to spike dramatically for any other sovereign borrower. That privilege is eroding. The dollar's share of the global central bank reserves has fallen from 72% in 2000 to approximately 57% in 2026. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have pursued de-dollarization with increasing urgency, a process that accelerated sharply after the United States froze Russia's dollar-denominated sovereign assets following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. That action demonstrated
See, sadly, when you're playing Laurel Playground with stuff like this, you know you might not like the war, but because they froze the assets like they did with the extreme embargoes, I think the term is. I can't think right now. So there was a reaction to that, and because we did that, there's a move for de-dollarization, which can hurt us to service our debt. Things are not as easy as they seem, not as
every central bank on Earth that the United States could weaponize the dollar system, which created
Sanctions,
an incentive for countries with adversarial relationships with Washington to diversify away from it. The Chinese renminbi holds approximately 2% of global reserves and faces capital controls incompatible with true reserve currency status. No credible alternative exists today. A gradual erosion of dollar privilege, even partial, would add hundreds of billions in annual interest costs by raising increasing the market demanded yield on Treasury bonds. Theoretical models suggest that even a modest reduction in safe asset demand produces a steady-state dollar depreciation of 7.6% and an increase in long-term interest rates of nearly 1 full percentage point. On $39 trillion in outstanding debt, one additional percentage point in borrowing costs adds approximately $300 to $350 billion per year in interest payments. The Penn-Wharton budget model, run by economists at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, places the window for manageable reform at approximately 2043 under favorable assumptions. Under pessimistic assumptions, where investor confidence deteriorates earlier, that window closes sometime in the early 2030s. After that point, the Penn-Wharton analysis finds no feasible combination of tax increases and spending cuts capable of preventing either explicit default or severe inflation. February 2026 baseline projects debt held by the public reaching 120% of gross domestic product by 2036, 144% by 2046, and 175% by 2056 under current law. The Treasury Department's own 75-year fiscal projection contained in the fiscal year 2025 financial report shows debt to gross domestic product reaching approximately 576% by 2100 under current policy. Understanding why nothing changes requires examining political incentives that operate more.
Sorry, I just asked Greg something. I just want to see what it'll say. US CPI Consumer Price Index manipulation criticism centers on the claims that official inflation figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics significantly understate the cost of living increases. These debates have been intensified in recent years due to the high post-pandemic prices, methodological changes in data collection issues, and political tension. Critics, including economics like John Williams of Shadow Staff, some investors, and political advisors, argue the CPI doesn't reflect what households actually experience. Keep heights. Some claim using the 1980s methods will show inflation 3 to 10% higher today. For example, 6 to 12% in official low periods. Official BLS rebuttals say these overstate bias trends were recommended by Christians like Botskin in 1996 for accuracy. My point with asking us is, imagine the motivation United States has to try to figure out a way to underplay the CPI, because CPI is tied with consumer confidence and investor confidence, as they actually release the actual rates people are experiencing. This means you would actually have to have greater interest rates to try to push that down. Remember, all the higher for longer we're raising interest rates, to combat inflation. So if the inflation's really higher, the interest rates should be higher. And if the interest rates should be higher, how much money we pay to service this debt is higher. So it's all linked.
Reliably than any fiscal rule Congress has ever written. Economist James Buchanan received the 1986 Nobel Prize for Public Choice Theory, the framework that treats politicians as rational, self-interested actors responding to the same incentive structures as everyone else. Buchanan observed that once Keynesian economics made deficit spending intellectually respectable in the mid-20th century, Democratic politicians faced a structurally rewarding calculation. Spending generates immediate visible benefits for identifiable voters. Tax increases generate immediate visible pain for identifiable voters. Borrowing defers the pain to future taxpayers who cannot vote yet. So the rational political
So, I just tracked as there's recent, because I know there's rate changes to stuff. I just don't know which makes it. math allows with what was exactly Chinese. Keeps the basketball conversations. So wage shift and real spending. Slight reductions in some food and housing shares if consumers cut back or shift calories. So they're cutting back because things are costing so much. And because they're cutting back, they put less weight in the CPI. And you see how there's a conflict of interest there doing it?
Calculation consistently favors spending, tax cuts, and borrowing. Mansur Olson supplied the second half of the explanation. The people who benefit from any specific government program are concentrated, organized, and intensely motivated to protect it. The people who pay for it are dispersed, individually bearing too small a cost to mobilize against it. Applied to Social Security and Medicare, 70 million beneficiaries vote at a dramatically higher rate than 30-year-olds who will service that debt. And they know precisely in dollars what any benefit cut cost them personally. And these numbers are bipartisan. Reagan increased the nominal national debt by 186%. George H.W. Bush added 54%. Clinton added 32%, the slowest growth in 40 years. George Bush more than doubled the debt, adding $5.85 trillion. Obama then added $8.34 trillion.
So the thing to keep in mind, these percentages is based off the current debt. So Reagan added a ton of debt, and then Bush Sr. added another 54% on top of it. Then Clinton added another 32% on top of it. But there was actually a little bit surplus in between. And then Bush Jr. came on and added 100%. Then Obama, I think the bailout was between. Then Bush raised a bit. Some of the bailouts was all around. I'm bad with years. But anyways, so Bush Jr. added 107%. Then Obama added 74% on top of that. Then Trump 1 added 39% on top of that. Then Biden added 26% on top of that. And then Trump 2 added 15% on top of that. And majority of this is from that big beautiful bill that I'm mad about because there's no crisis to service this huge amount of increase. At least during Trump 1 and Biden, between the two, at least you had COVID issues, but the end of Biden was taking care of the COVID issues, so you had no reason for this $3.5 trillion big beautiful thing. It's so frustrating.
Over 8 years, and Trump's first term added $8.1 trillion in just 4 years, nearly matching Obama's 8-year total. Biden then added approximately $7 trillion, and Trump's second term began with legislation projecting $4.1 trillion in additional deficits over a decade. Dick Cheney captured the governing philosophy of both parties in 2002 when he told Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, "Reagan proved deficits don't matter. We won the midterms." The starve the beast strategy that Republicans deployed for 4 decades, a theory that cutting taxes would force Congress to cut spending, produced the opposite result. Economist Christina and David Romer's definitive National Bureau of Economic Research study found no evidence that tax cuts restrained government spending. The data showed they increased it. William Niskanen, chairman of the Libertarian Cato Institute, concluded that deficits effectively discount government services for the current generation, making programs more popular with voters, not less. The strategy designed to shrink government by cutting its revenue instead gave voters access to government services at a perceived discount while billing future generations. The one serious modern attempt at comprehensive bipartisan reform, the Simpson-Bowles Commission of 2010, produced a detailed plan covering $4 trillion in deficit reduction through spending cuts, tax reform eliminating most deductions, Social Security adjustments raising the retirement age to 69 by 2075, and Medicare restructuring. 11 of 18 commissioners voted for it, a majority but not the 14-vote supermajority required to advance it to Congress automatically. Paul Ryan voted against it because it raised revenue. Progressive Democrats voted against it because it cut entitlements. The House floor vote in March 2012 resulted in 382 votes against it and only 38 in favor. The 2000 2011 Obama-Boehner grand bargain came even closer to actually happening. For weeks, the two negotiated a framework for a $4 trillion fiscal deal covering agency spending cuts, including the Pentagon, meaningful Medicare and Social Security changes, and between $800 billion and $1 trillion in new revenue from tax reform. Congressional staff had drafted actual legislative text, but it collapsed when Obama pushed for additional revenue. Tea Party Republicans refused any tax increases under any circumstances, and Speaker Boehner walked away on July 22, 2011. Neither party has attempted anything of comparable scope since. A 2022 peer-reviewed study in political behavior titled Deficit Attention Disorder found strong evidence that both Republicans and Democrats shift their stated concern about deficit reduction based on which party holds the White House. The concern tracks partisan advantage more reliably than it tracks the actual fiscal trajectory. And of course, this hasn't surprised any serious financial analyst or normal person. The debt problem already manifests in the lives of ordinary Americans in ways that trace directly back to federal borrowing, even when the connection is invisible. 30-year mortgage rates track the 10-year Treasury yield. The federal government's issuance of $1.8 trillion in new bonds each year competes.
See what he said about the height. Borrowing from buying houses track the 10-year yield. So, if you have more CPI, you need to hike interest rates. High interest rate means you have to pay more interest on the debt directly to like we're doing, like how you went to the paycheck for the U.S. budget. So not only does the payments increase because the interest rates are higher, but people have to pay more interest rate for their homes, because it tracks the 10-year yield.
For investment capital in the same markets that fund home purchases. Higher Treasury yields push mortgage rates higher. The National Association of Realtors estimated that each 1 percentage point increase in mortgage rates removes approximately 3 million potential home buyers from the market. The connection between the federal debt and housing affordability runs through Treasury bond yields, interest rate competition, and the diminished purchasing power of American households directly and measurably. For younger Americans, the problem arrives from two directions simultaneously. A 2025 Talker Research survey found Gen Z carrying average personal debt of $94,101, far exceeding millennials at $59,181.
So because of everything costing more, there's an individual has to take on more debt to cover that. So even individual, it's not looking good. Again, this is why I constrain my investing in biotech, because of all these different issues.
And Gen X at $53,255. 52% of Gen Z respondents said debt occupied their thoughts for most of the time. 41% ran out of money every month. Only 22% considered themselves financially stable, and that's why they should use DollarWise. Gen Z also confronts the national debt from the fiscal side. The generation that will spend the largest share of its working life servicing the national debt accumulated by previous generations carries the highest personal debt burden of any generation in recorded American history. They are being squeezed from both ends at the same time by personal financial obligations that exceed what previous generations faced at the same age, and by a national fiscal obligation that no generation before them inherited at anything close to this scale. The cultural response to this combination has produced some of the most honest economic commentary in years, even if it emerged from TikTok rather than the Federal Register. And that is doom spending. The practice of making impulsive purchases out of a fatalistic conviction we're saving for a future that you cannot afford is pointless. Spread as a documented behavioral pattern among young adults in 2024 and 2025.
So that's another thing, because sentiment is so low for the future, people are just spending money. They're like, well, I'm not gonna be around anyways, so might as well enjoy life now. So it's very sad.
mentality is that if the housing market, student debt, and projected Social Security cuts make financial security feel structurally unavailable, optimizing for immediate consumption is a rational response to an irrational situation. Loud budgeting, the counter movement where young people publicly declare their financial limits to remove the social stigma of not spending, emerged alongside it, a generation negotiating in real time between despair and discipline. The EY Quest economic modeling group.
This actually, this logic of doomsday actually, stems from investing behavior. So what these younger generations do, they feel so helpless, as they might take, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, even sometimes 100 or $200,000, and they'll buy some type of Jolo tongue, even one DTU, it means, expires in 1 day. So you might see on Twitter rules about someone losing like $200,000 within a day, or gaining $1 million within a day. The reason for that is because they have so much money in these risky options, is that they'll either make it big or they'll lose it all. So they just do everything in these risky plays because I'm not gonna have a future anyway. This is the only way I'm gonna have a future is if this train works out.
Estimated that if the national debt continues toward 206% of gross domestic product by 2075 without stabilization, the accumulated drag on the economy will eliminate 1.2 million jobs and shrink private investment by 13.
And I actually run a similar logic, but in a different way. So I have a lot of money in the stock market, and it's like, if I don't do this, I'm not gonna be able to live in the future. You know, if it either works out and I have a life in the future, or it doesn't work out and I'm in the same situation where I didn't do it. So that's why I invest the way I do.
6% by 2035. By 2075, the same model projects 3.6 million jobs permanently.
So in other words, the logic is, if these doom scenarios do happen, and I put a lot of value through my side picks, I would be in no different situation than if I wouldn't invest at all. But if the doomsday scenario is wrong, at least I'll have some money through the dividend collections and everything else. I have a similar logic, just not doing the all or nothing.
Lost a 21.6% collapse in private capital investment and a 5.3% permanent reduction in average worker wages relative to a stabilized debt scenario. These are actually not the most alarming projections available. It only represents a moderate economic case for what happens when a government crowds out private investment by absorbing an ever-growing share of available capital. So what is next? Here are the four most probable paths looking forward. The most likely path is continued muddling, large structural deficits, rising interest costs, more credit downgrades, and the gradual erosion of fiscal flexibility over years and decades. No dramatic collapse, no resolution, but the debt grows, the options narrow, and the interest bill claims a larger share of every year's budget. In this scenario, the standard of living for younger Americans rises more slowly than it would have under a different fiscal trajectory. The second path runs through 2032 to 2033, when Social Security and Medicare trust funds deplete and Congress faces a forcing event it can no longer defer by doing nothing. A 23% automatic benefit cut for 70 million Social Security recipients would produce an immediate contraction in consumer spending, severe pressure on elderly healthcare decisions, and political consequences.
This is what we call kicking the can down the road. Oh, it's not our problem now. We'll just let future selves in 5 years figure it out.
that would make every other fiscal debate of the past decade look mild by comparison.
I'm sorry,
Action
7
taken
years.
under that kind of duress consistently produces worse policy outcomes than taking action in advance. Every year of delay raises that required adjustment by 35%. The third path is a bond market event, a sharp repricing of Treasury debt that forces emergency fiscal action the way bond markets forced Prime Minister Truss out of office in 45 days. The United States possesses structural advantages that make this scenario less likely than it would be for any other debtor nation. But those advantages do not make it impossible. In April 2025, markets came close enough to demonstrate that vigilantes are paying attention.
I don't know if you actually heard the story about this, about the England, European Union, or whatever, about this Prime Minister or head of lettuce. They had like both things that I countered, and like, which will last longer, this person or the head of lettuce, and the head of lettuce one.
The fourth path, and the rarest historically, requires a genuine bipartisan political coalition to produce comprehensive reform before any of the previous forces the issue. Democrats accepting structural modifications to entitlement programs and Republicans accepting some form of revenue adjustment. The 1983 Greenspan Commission saved Social Security for 50 years through a deal between Ronald Reagan and Democratic Speaker Tip O'Neill. The political conditions of 2026 make a comparable deal difficult to imagine, but the conditions of 1983 also looked impossible until the deal happened. Ray Dalio summarized the situation in his 2025 book, How Countries Go Broke. There's a low risk of imminent debt crisis, but a very high long-term risk. We are approaching a point of no return and the debt death spiral is nearing. The most probable and ultimate resolution in Dalio's framework and in most serious fiscal analysis is not explicit default, which a currency issuing nation can always avoid by printing money, but currency debasement, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury tolerating sustained inflation above their stated targets, eroding the real value of the debt over time by making every dollar worth less in purchasing power. This is
See, this goes into something I talked about yesterday about one of the realistic solutions, and Donald Trump kind of implied supporting it, is inflating the debt away. So you make the dollar worth a lot less, so that makes the debt, paying the debt more manageable, since that does sound worth as less.
Precisely how the post-war debt mountain disappeared between 1946 and 1951. The creditors who held treasury bonds through those years watched the real value of their savings decline. They bore the cost without a formal mechanism to resist it. The United States possesses structural advantages no other heavily indebted nation in history has held simultaneously. The world's prime reserve currency, the deepest and most liquid capital market on earth, the ability to borrow exclusively in its own currency, and a central bank with the institutional credibility to intervene in crisis conditions. These advantages are real and they are substantial. They buy time that Greece, Argentina, and Weimar Germany never had. But they don't get rid of the math in front of us. Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff titled their landmark History of Sovereign Debt Crises, This Time is Different. Deliberately ironic because in 8 centuries of fiscal crises spanning dozens of countries and every variety of government and economic system, it never actually is. Countries that avoided crisis consistently believed their circumstances were exceptional. The United States has strong grounds for claiming exceptional circumstances. It has weaker grounds for assuming those circumstances last forever. The debt shows up already in the mortgage rate that prices a buyer out of a home, in the paycheck eroded by inflation, in the Social Security benefit that arrives smaller than promised, in the research grant that loses its funding, in the military compatibility that shrinks relative to rivals because interest on old debt crowds the defense budget. The debt costs Americans money they cannot trace to a specific origin and cannot escape through any individual decision. Ernest Hemingway described the bankruptcy as arriving in 2 stages, gradually, then suddenly. The United States is still in the gradual stage, but whether that changes depends on whether American political institutions can find the will to act before the bond market removes the choice. I'll see you in the next one. I'll be candid. Front page loses money. The cost of research.
So, what do you think about that? But yeah, but that ending point is very strong. It's either the bond market's gonna force them to act, or are they gonna figure out a way to before that point. So something, so change is inevitable. It's just, it's just a matter of time. And what exactly happens, we don't know. Like something's gonna get. I'm trying not to deep breath. The thing is, even though the situation is bad, it's not like Germany, going having 1.4 trillion, whatever, lies for, 4.3 trillion inflation. It's not gonna be that bad. We do have a lot of advantages compared to them. Like, we still have a lot of reserve currency status. It is growing. You have to admit it is growing. We could have to be aware of that, but the advantage still exists. And there is ways to deal with it. It's just a question of how much will it actually let you push, cut, to shove in dealing with it. It could be a lot less than what people expect. It might, in other words, the effect of the stock market, if you want to take this, it might be something in between the quote-unquote correction between the COVID crash and the 2008 crash. I don't think the 2008 crash will repeat, but there will be some correction. It's just a question of what exactly. So there's no point of it's a worrying of something I'm controlled. Like myself. I put this in action with my own investment. So I have concerns. I put those concerns in the I-bond market, into I-bonds, and I still invest in biotech because of my concerns. But if my concerns were so great, everything's doomed, I would just stick my money under the mattress, which I don't do. I still have my mind working for me. It's just more conservative ways. Sound might actually speak for themselves. How exactly I am, and how exactly I feel. I'm not here and saying, oh no, we're gonna lose 9% of the stock market like some people do on Twitter, that's raise rate. But on our side coin, the trade concern is a real concern. Like you saw in the chart, we recovered since then, obviously. But yeah, it has real applications. Basically, what I'm saying is, people saying Sarah's fun is overrated. But yes, there is issues, but the world's not gonna hype. We've been through these situations before, and we came out every time. Great Depression, the dot-com, the housing crisis 2008, COVID, the tariff bear market that lasted like a week. So, think about the tariff. Like last year, this was the last year. Like 13 months ago. Oh my god, we are so doomed. Tariffs are gonna cause a great crash. And I bought stock and everything, and it's been up ever since. So. So it's a good idea to be aware of these, so you know what to look for. So you know what to for in your life choice. You'd be like, hey, we need to pay more taxes. What the frick are you doing? We need to solve our debt problem. Now, let it happen one way or the other. You know how to do it now, or the bond market will make you do it. Yeah, well, if something's gonna give eventually. No one is above the market. The invisible hand will twist you to do something. That is why I find this stuff so interesting. Like, the most powerful force of them all is the free market. Every single person has a hand in these persons. Every action you take has a small increase in supply and demand. And always remember, Walmart knows what you're gonna buy before you do. I lost my voice about an hour yesterday, but yeah, I just tried that and you think Google is scary with all its data collection, or Meta, or Amazon? No, no, not Meta. They got nothing on Walmart. Walmart is your true big brother. You know what it is. And stop buying those Dunkin' Donut drinks. They have a week's worth of sugar in them. There's an idea. Just, just give a 50% tax rate on sugar drinks like Dunkin' Donuts. I bet people stop buying those less with prices like that. If you wanna tax the Medicare system, you're gonna have to pay for it. You want your diabetes drink, you have to pay $9 for it. And as we just saw to the video, we saw how much our Medicare is over spending. Yeah, and part of that is because blind third Americans are some kind diabetic, pre-diabetes or There's two Chinese or something. Hang on, I can just scratch that real quick actually. Let's see, what's your music question? One hundred? No, it shouldn't be. 115.2 million American adults have pre-diabetes. That's more than 2 in 5 adults. What the frick? 43%? That's insane! I knew it was high. I said 1 in 3. That's pretty close. That's actually higher than what I said. It's crazy what these drinks do to our Medicare system and all the costs associated with them. Too much sugar. Cut the sugar. Happy United States Service is that do your part, eat less sugar, do your pay tie, do the less sugar, less sugar, less sugar, less sugar. You know how we have our mega nationalism, make America great, America patriotism. They should have a new slogans. Eat less sugar, do your part to service our debt. Less sugar, less. Really, let me see here. No, bites up for a second. Another interesting that I feel that this ties into is how the younger generations feel about actually this is probably interesting.
Let's go
We'll
back.
talk about this.
Take control.
The funny thing is, UK is actually, if UK was actually a state, they would rank like #1 in a lot of things, but they're actually poorer than Mississippi, which is actually pretty stunning. I actually heard this before, so I actually did not pre-watch this, but I'm assuming it follows the same logic that I've seen before. So let's see.
On April 13th, 2026, the Institute of Economic Affairs in London
Oh, by
published
the
the
way,
results of a national survey that the British government
are
would
you
have
able
probably
to
preferred the
hear
British
it?
public never to see.
I wanna make sure that
3,000 British voters answered
volume is
one
right.
simple question. If the United Kingdom were a state inside the United States of America, where would it rank for income per person? The average Briton guessed 7th, placing the country above Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. But the actual answer was 51st, meaning the United Kingdom ranked dead last, behind every single American state, behind Alabama, behind West Virginia, behind Arkansas, and behind Mississippi. The state Americans themselves have mocked for over 150 years as the poorest, slowest, most rural corner of the country. The modern United Kingdom, a country that ruled 1/4 of the planet just 100 years ago, that invented the steam engine and the jet engine and modern banking, that fought Napoleon and Hitler and built the railways of India, is now statistically poorer per person than a state whose median household income ranks 50th.
It seemed, it has a strong basis for like a lot of modern technology, but like they start with the steam engines on the pre-industrial revolution and then afterwards, and now poorer than Mississippi. Isn't that crazy to think about?
Out of 50 in America, and almost nobody in Britain knows it happened. The numbers aren't close. British public sector net debt sits at 93% of GDP in early 2026, the highest level since the early 1960s. Roughly £2.9 trillion, or 102,000 pounds of national debt for every household in the country, with interest payments alone costing British taxpayers £111 billion a year. Industrial electricity in the United Kingdom cost 26.6
look, he's talking about their national debt now, too.
The highest of the 25 wealthy nations tracked by the International Energy Agency, roughly 4 times what American factories pay. In 2025, the Swiss firm Henley and Partners recorded 16,500 millionaires permanently leaving the United Kingdom, taking $91.8 billion of wealth with them, which became the largest net outflow of rich people ever measured in any country in any year in human history. A further 257,000 ordinary British citizens followed them out the door in 2024, the highest emigration figure since 1964, and 3/4.
Pulling out that much money and your investments is actually not good. But they can still be invested in certain things and might see them despite them leaving with Ordinals. The United States stock market is so centralized to the world nowadays.
Of those immigrants were under the age of 35. The young, the skilled, and the rich were all walking away at the same time. The International Monetary Fund cut growth to 0.8% for 2026, the sharpest downgrade in the G7. A British GP working for the National Health Service now earns roughly half what the same doctor earns in Sydney, while a British software engineer earns a third of what the same engineer earns in San Francisco. And a British family home near London costs 25 times the average local salary. British industrial output per worker has actually shrunk 0.5% over the last.
All these statistics is crazy. I didn't know about these. Like, I didn't know about these finer details, but I knew the general idea of it before I click in this video. That's why I clicked it. I'm like, yeah, oh yeah, I heard about this before. And that's why I was kind of interested in it. But yeah, all these statistics blow my mind right now. This gives you an idea. This actually reinforces my point what I meant earlier. Like, for the United States, it's bad, but it's not like, it's not worst world ending, oh my god, the world will end next year or something like that. Like, there is legitimate problems to be talked about and to solve, but we are in a better position than a lot of places historically were when they were going through their hyperinflation debt, and same thing with the United Kingdom currently, because of all these issues. So,
years, the second worst collapse on record. The 5th largest economy in the world has been quietly rotting from the inside for a quarter of a century, and the bill is now coming due. So this is the story of how the country that once ruled the world became statistically poorer than its former colonies' poorest.
Have you ever heard the saying, the sun never set on Great Britain. I was wondering if you're aware where that comes from. Or even what I'm saying. I can explain it, I just want to let you know. I'm just curious. Wait, life with Craig 63 is for minute. But doesn't make sense. Let's try this. Okay, so the reason why this was said, the sun never set on the Great Britain, it's because back in the colonial days, they had like Australia and a whole bunch of different islands that they controlled. It was insane on how much they controlled. They were like rivaling ancient land with the amount of area they can control. Let me see if I can tighten it up actually, such you never heard of us. And yeah, I don't know. Waiting. That is sao lại mệt mình. Alien. And only bring Smith, huh? With houses? Okay, this is I actually like this a lot. This is the interactive map that shows you. I'll show this. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Let me actually make this a different way now. Let's see. Head source. Window kitchen. Wait, this you cover me up. Okay. Okay. Yep, cover me up. In 1416, I just had a great grand. Watch this. See. Okay, so this here was the British part. So the reason why they said the sun never set in Great Britain is this is why. It's because they own all this. They own all of these little islands here. This is why I wanted a bigger screen for this, because there's a lot of little islands that they colonize. They even had children. So did you know that they live there for all of this? That's why you have the Australia flag, have the Great Britain corner thing. Because, yeah, Great Britain actually owned Australia. So that's where the saying comes from. The sun never set in the Great Britain Empire because it literally never did. The sun was always up somewhere on something they owned. And the other thing is, another thing you might not know about this. In winter, Great Britain, or England is so far north that the last days of twilight never sets in summer, like for 2 weeks, and then that last bit of twilight never ends. The thing is that twilight is so dark is that it still looks like nighttime to the human eye. But yeah, that's just a rule tip that you might not know. There's a third season of twilight that actually never sets in England for like 2 weeks in winter or summer. Sorry. England is pretty far north. I think it's further north than people give credit for. When I went over in the winter, the sun didn't rise until like 9 o'clock in the morning. It set at like 3. It's crazy how short their winter can be. Their winter days. You can't see the third twilight. It just looks right. It just looks night to you. You won't be able to observe it. But if you visit Alaska, you can see the midnight sunset because of that. But there's nothing special observable in England. It's just a low fact that we can't really make use of. But yeah, that's where the saying comes from. The sun never sets on the British Empire because of how much they own.
Date. The story has to start back in 1945. In the summer
That just
of that
gives you an
year,
idea
the
how
United
far
Kingdom
they
finished
came
the
from
Second World War as the
1920s.
second largest economy on the planet, behind only the United States. London was the largest city in Europe. The British Empire still formed.
Yeah, see, we saw that on the map. How the British Empire owned India. This wasn't going on till the 1920s. Do you know what significant the 1920s was? It's a big key. It's a big date. It's a big date there. World War One. The Ordinals One ripped them apart. That's what started the history.
Governed India, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, Malaya, and dozens of smaller territories stretching across every continent except Antarctica. The city of London processed nearly.
Yeah, we just looked at that. See what I mean? This is where the sayings, the sunset never set in the British Empire. Because they own so much. You can have the sun up here when it starts here. Plus it's light here, it's down there, you know? The sun never set in the British Empire. They owned a lot.
Half of the world's international trade finance, and the pound sterling remained a global reserve currency. On paper, Britain was a superpower, but in practice, Britain was bankrupt. The war had cost 25% of the country's national wealth, burned through 250% of GDP in public debt, killed 450,000 British citizens, and flattened large sections of London, Coventry, Liverpool, and Plymouth, with bread and meat still rationed well into the post-war years. In the general election of July 1945, while Winston Churchill was still in Berlin negotiating the end of the war, British voters threw him out of office and elected Clement Attlee, a quiet socialist schoolmaster who promised to build a brand new Britain from the rubble. Attlee nationalized coal, the railways, the steel industry, the electricity
I think
grid,
it's
the gas
underestimated.
network,
Like if you're asking me, like I think people underappreciate of how much World War I ripped apart England economically. It's very brutal for them.
aviation, and eventually the Bank of England itself. In July 1948, Attlee founded the National Health Service, the world's largest fully tax-funded healthcare system, which still today employs 1.37 million people, making it the 5th largest employer on the planet, behind only the U.S. Department of Defense, the People's Liberation Army of China, Walmart, and McDonald's. The British called this arrangement the post-war consensus, while Americans called it freaking socialism. For about 20 years, the post-war consensus census delivered much of what Attlee and his successors promised, with living standards rising, slums being cleared, council housing built at 126,000 new homes per year between 1946 and 1980, and wages climbing steadily. Harold Macmillan, a conservative prime minister, told a crowd in Bedford in 1957 that most British people had, quote, never had it so good. And for a brief window, it was true. However, underneath the comfortable numbers, a slower and uglier process was grinding away because the rest of the world was catching up. West Germany and Japan, both physically destroyed in 1945 and both occupied by American soldiers, rebuilt faster, cheaper, and smarter than Britain ever managed. The West German economy grew 8% per year through the 1950s. The Japanese economy grew 10% per year through the 1960s. Britain, by comparison, grew 2.5%. By 1970, a country that had been the richest large economy in Europe in 1945 had fallen to 14th in the world on income per person, trailing Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, and every Nordic country on the map. The world had a name for the quiet decline and called Britain the sick man of Europe. But the sick man got sicker through the 1970s. A coal miners' strike in January 1974 forced Prime Minister Edward Heath to declare a 3-day working week, which shut offices at lunchtime, turned televisions dark at 10:30 each night to save electricity, and left hospitals operating by candlelight. In 1976, the British government ran out of money and had to beg the International Monetary Fund for a $3.9 billion emergency loan, which was the largest bailout the IMF had ever issued up to that point. Inflation hit 25% that year as the pound collapsed. And then, in the winter of 1978 to 1979, the country ground to a full stop in what became known as the Winter of Discontent. Garbage collectors struck and rubbish piled 10 feet high in London's Leicester Square. Gravediggers struck and bodies stacked in storage because cemeteries could not bury them. Teachers, bankers, and hospital porters all went out as well. At the peak of the chaos, Prime Minister James Callaghan flew home from a warm weather summit in the Caribbean and was asked by a reporter at Heathrow Airport what to do about the mounting crisis at home. Callaghan answered he did not think there was mounting chaos. The next day's headline in the Sun newspaper ran 3 words across its front page. Crisis. What crisis? Callaghan lost the election 4 months later. In May 1979, a 53-year-old grocer's daughter from the small English town of Grantham walked into 10 Downing Street and became the first female prime minister in British history. Her name.
This is kind of similar to our current situation when back in and I forget the year. Oh, it had to do with the recovery around like 2021. I think he said it. There is either early 2022 or early 2021. They're like, this inflation's just transitory. Nothing than what happened, and they end up being permanently sooner.
Her name was Margaret Thatcher, and over the next 11 years, she attempted something no British leader had tried since the 19th century, declaring open war on the British welfare state. Thatcher privatized British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, British Steel, and British Petroleum, and then sold off the electricity grid, the water companies, and the railways. Thatcher crushed the coal miners' union in a year-long strike that ended with the miners walking back to work beaten, and cut the top rate of income tax from 83% to 60%, then to 40%. In 1986, Thatcher deregulated the city of London in a reform called the Big Bang, which flooded the city with American, Japanese, German, and Swiss banks, turning the square mile along the Thames into the largest international financial center on the planet. For most of the 1980s, the reforms worked. Growth accelerated, unemployment fell, London boomed, and the sick man of Europe label faded as American journalists began describing a British economic miracle. The Thatcher Revolution had a price, though, and the bill came due in the regions that the boom forgot. Because the coal towns of Yorkshire
feels like reading now his that exactly was my criticism on like people trying to follow Trump's tariff on plan. I'm like, we tried this before. It was called the early 1900s. we knew it didn't work. That's why we didn't. That's why we stopped doing it. We stopped doing it because we know it doesn't work. Like, the tariff is basically just a tax on plot. Like, learn history. And exactly what we needed. Not to the same extreme, not to the same degree, but we're still paying for it. Pun intended. Get it? But yeah, we're literally paying for that mistake that general humans can learn from history. Making the same historic
Or
mistake.
South Wales never recovered, and the steel towns of Sherfield and Scunthorpe never recovered, and the shipbuilding towns of Newcastle and Glasgow never recovered. The country that had built the machinery of the Industrial Revolution lost the habit of building things at all, trading in its factories for a financial services industry headquartered in a single square mile of London. By the time Tony Blair won the 1997 general election and moved Labour into Downing Street, the British economy had split almost completely in two. London and the southeast were rich, educated, global, and service-based, while the rest of the country, the industrial north, the old mining valleys, the coastal towns, the midlands, was living on what economists politely called structural unemployment and what everyone else called the dole. The two Britons spoke different accents, voted different parties, watched different television programs, earned wildly different incomes, and the gaps kept widening. Tony Blair and his successor Gordon Brown rode the financial boom of the late 1990s and early 2000s for everything it was worth. As London's banks lent money to everyone, house prices doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled, and Blair opened British borders wide to citizens of the new Eastern European members of the European Union in 2004, driving population growth and consumer demand. Public spending climbed from 35% of GDP in 1997 to 42% by 2008. Nobody in Westminster noticed that every percentage point of British GDP growth was borrowed, either from foreign lenders, from Chinese savers, or from British homeowners mortgaging properties that were about to collapse in value. In September 2008, the American investment bank Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and the 40-year British experiment
See? How close our world economy is tied because of our deregulation that led to, so the reason why the 2009 crash happened was partly because of, okay, so here's exactly what happened was that, you wanna buy a $200,000 house, but you only make $50,000? Fine, we'll give you a loan, because I'll be worth $500,000 in 5 years. So they would give all these loans to people that couldn't afford the loans because they assumed the house market would just keep on going up and up and up. But what happens when it doesn't go up and up and up anymore? This wasn't happening. Financial institutions selling these loans. So instead of having the actual banks carry that risk, the banks would sell these loans off to like financial institutions, and these financial institutions would chop it up and sell these little pieces of loan like you buy shares in a company. And they would get these shares to like normal people. These normal people was the exit liquidity. And when that no longer worked, Lehman buyers went.
investment in financial services as a substitute for manufacturing unraveled in a single afternoon. Two of Britain's four largest banks had to be nationalized to stop them from going under, costing the British taxpayer £137 billion in direct cash and guarantees, as GDP fell 4.3% in 2009 in the steepest British recession since the 1930s. Most importantly of all, British productivity, meaning the amount of economic output the average British worker produces in 1 hour of work, which remains the single most important number in any modern economy, simply stopped growing. Between 2008 and 2024, British
So because of that situation in the United States, and that basically affected the world economy, and that negatively impacted Britain for these reasons he's explained. But I'm curious, did you know about the 2008 crash being explained like that? I was wondering how good I was explaining that compared to other stuff you might have heard about it. Just go real quick. I've heard that before, but didn't know your explanation specifically. Okay. Did you know about them buying the loans like that? I was wondering what type you knew before. Sorry, I was like, it's in the pretend way better than this. It's no problem, I'll be waiting. I was just curious. But yeah, I'm guessing you knew about the loan part, about some people's loans they can't afford, but there's that other part of it. Hello, Tikimatsu. Hi, I'm just explaining about the 2009 financial crash and how that impacted Britain. So, you came in the middle of that. So I'm guessing you knew about the loans a lot of people couldn't afford. But this is why Lehman Brothers went under, because they actually bought those risky loans and sold them off through derivatives. And it's that situation that Michael Burry ended up shorting. So
activity per hour worked grew by an average of 0.6 per year, the worst performing among the 7 wealthy group of 7 economies other than Italy. Between 2019 and 2024, British productivity actually contracted by 0.5%, the second worst 5-year collapse since British statisticians started tracking the number in the 1970s. American productivity, by comparison, grew 1.9% per year over the same stretch, driven by the technology industry and a domestic energy boom from shale oil and shale gas, so American workers pulled steadily ahead while British workers fell quietly behind. Nobody in London.
Sorry for pausing it. My mom wants to play with bunnies. Whoa, let me talk. It's play with them. that? I don't know. He'll pay attention. Nope. Okay, so now I continue the video. Say about that. But like I said, I've never seen this video before, so I knew on this something.
The answer, when economists finally pieced it all together, was simple and honestly ugly. The country had stopped investing, stopped building, and stopped making. British firms spent 18.9% of GDP on capital investment in 2024, the lowest rate in the G7, while British infrastructure crumbled and British trains still ran on Victorian-era track. Whenever researchers at Oxford, Cambridge, or Imperial College London did invent something valuable, the technology was almost always sold to an American buyer within 5 years. ARM Holdings, a Cambridge-founded semiconductor designer whose chips sit inside nearly every smartphone on Earth, was sold to SoftBank of Japan for £24.3 billion in 2016, and then listed its shares not in London, but on the American NASDAQ.
Yeah, is it going really crazy? I was there for the IPO, so...
In September 2023. DeepMind, the British artificial intelligence lab responsible for some of the most important AI breakthroughs in human history, was sold to Google in 2014. British Volt, a £3.8 billion electric vehicle battery factory the British government had promised would anchor the country's green industrial future, collapsed into bankruptcy in January 2023 and was sold for scrap at £8.6 million, roughly 0.2% of what the project was supposed to cost. The country still produced world-class talent, but could no longer hold onto any of it. That slow-motion transfer from London to Boston, from Cambridge, England to Cambridge, Massachusetts, from Imperial College to Silicon Valley, has accelerated at the exact moment that the British government has decided to make Britain more expensive to live in, build in, work in, and be wealthy in than at almost any other time in its modern history. The total British tax burden, meeting government revenue as a share of the whole economy, will reach 37.7% of GDP by 2027 to 2028, the highest level in British post-war history. The personal income tax allowance, meaning the amount a British worker can earn, total British tax burden, meeting government...
So, we were just going into this about with the United States tax burdens, where it's like, $240,000 per person. So, the British tax burden is not doing too hot either. 30% of GDP is actually really bad.
Revenue as a share of the whole economy will reach 37.7% of GDP by 2027 to 2028, the highest level in British post-war history. The personal income tax allowance, meaning the amount a British worker can earn before paying any tax at all, has been frozen at £12,570 since 2021, and the freeze has now been extended all the way to April 2031. A single policy, freezing the threshold while wages slowly rise, will quietly raise £55.5 billion a year for the British Treasury by 2030, the largest single tax increase in 60 years. And almost nobody in the country realizes it is happening. By 2030, 24% of British taxpayers will be paying the higher 40% rate of income tax, up from just 15% in 2021. In the painful middle stretch of the income scale between £100,000 and £125,140 a year, a bizarre quirk in the British tax code gradually strips away the personal allowance itself, producing an effective marginal tax rate of 62% for exactly the kind of mid-career professionals, doctors, engineers, small business owners, and senior civil servants any country wants to keep. A British worker earning £110,000 a year pays a higher marginal tax rate than a British worker earning £400,000 a year. In October 2024, the new Labour government of Keir Starmer and Chancellor Rachel Reeves added a £25 billion hike to employer national insurance contributions, raised capital gains tax from a top rate of 20% to 24%, extended inheritance tax to private pensions starting in April 2027, capped agricultural property relief, which triggered the largest protest by British farmers since Starmer took office. The November 2025 budget
So capital gains tax is something I have to be very well aware of myself, because it's basically tax that you get on your profits for trading with buying and selling stocks. So that's what that refers to.
Added another 26 pounds on top of that, leading the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies to call the British Parliament, quote, the largest tax-rising parliament on record. So instead of actually learning how to manage the government's money, they just want to raise revenue instead. And that is easier said than done on a personal financial.
See, you did it again. So, you know how you were talking about earlier, how you cleverly weasel ads with the talking about financial situation in these countries. So there, that's what this is.
And that is why tens of thousands of active monthly users use the Dollarwise budgeting app. You can't always control what money comes in, but you can
it's a little
control
entertaining
where it
to me.
goes. When people
How
use Dollarwise, it automatically accounts to their connects, and they get the insights they need to actually choose what they spend their money on and where they want their goals to be in relation to that in the coming weeks, months, and years. Dollarwise is the best budgeting app to actually change your financial life, and there's a free trial, so there's literally no downside.
To be honest, I
checking it
think
out.
government
Download
as
Dollarwise or go to
institutions
Dollarwise.com
need
or click
better
that link in the description.
budgeters.
The response
Maybe they
from
should
the
take a
people
tip
who
or
have
two
the
from these
money and the
apps.
mobility to respond has been simply to leave. In 2025 alone, Henley and Partners recorded 16,500 millionaires permanently leaving the United Kingdom, meaning 16,500 people who sold their British houses, closed their British bank accounts, gave up their British tax residence, and moved. The total wealth that walked out with them was $91.8 billion, the largest single-year net outflow of rich people
Yes,
ever
please.
recorded in any country, anywhere. You might recognize some of the names. Lakshmi Mittal, the steel billionaire worth £14.9 billion who had been, until recently, a major donor to the Labour Party, left London for Dubai and Switzerland, citing the new inheritance tax rules on worldwide assets. Richard Noda, the vice chairman of Goldman Sachs in London, moved to Milan under Italy's new flat tax regime, which caps annual tax on foreign income at €200,000 regardless of wealth, becoming the first active senior investment bank.
As much as there is valid criticism against what Trump does, at least he was honest with one thing. The only way to solve the debt is to inflate our lakes. Is that's basically an unrealistic solution, yeah. That's basically what his dams and but at the same time, it's stupid that he did all those tax breaks to the rich to get $3 trillion in debt. It's like counterproductive.
To openly relocate. John Fredrickson, the Norwegian-born shipping magnate worth £13.2 billion, sold his London mansion and said, quote, "Britain has gone to hell." And Charles Mullins, a plumber-turned-millionaire who founded Pimlico Plumbers, one of the most famous small business success stories in British history, a man who has spent 30 years on British television telling young people that working-class Britain could still produce millionaires through hard graft and honest trade, sold everything, moved first to Spain and then to Dubai, and said publicly on his way out that Britain has declared war on the people who paid for Britain. But the exodus itself is not limited to the top of the wealth distribution. The Office for National Statistics recorded 252,000 British citizens permanently emigrating, the highest number in more than 60 years of records, with 3/4 of those immigrants under the age of 35. The departing cohort includes the next generation of British doctors, engineers, software developers, accountants, architects, and entrepreneurs, which is the exact human capital every healthy economy on Earth is fighting to retain. A British-trained junior doctor working full-time for the National Health Service makes roughly £37,000 a year. A British-trained junior doctor who relocates to Perth, Australia, makes roughly £80,000 a year for the same work, with shorter shifts, more autonomy, and the weather of Southern California. The Competent Authority Pathway, a special streamlined registration system, allows British doctors.
Another reason you can find this interesting is because remember when as we're giving references to the United States debt and how it's like now it's at the end of the road, something like Great Britain can happen to the United States, where they're no longer the world reserve. They're no longer a superpower, but they still exist. I mean, they still exist. Yeah, it's bad, but they still exist. It's not perfect. They still exist.
Doctors to skip the normal Australian medical exams entirely and start practicing within weeks of landing. Australian recruitment agencies now stand outside National Health Service picket lines, gearing British doctors.
This is why I say the complete collapse fear mongering is overblowing. Of course it's bad, of course there's gonna be bad situations, but they still exist. Their guys still exist. Racists will still exist.
Strikes, handing
It's
out
not
business.
big, that's
In 2024,
not
British
just
trained
the-
doctors
won't be
became
as strong
the
as they
single
used to be,
largest
but
source
still
of
exist.
overseas medical recruits for the entire Australian healthcare system. British industrial electricity costs roughly 4 times what American industrial electricity costs, which is the difference between a factory surviving and a factory shutting down. In January 2025, AstraZeneca, the British-Swedish pharmaceutical giant that is the single largest company on the London Stock Exchange by market value, cancelled a £450 million vaccine manufacturing expansion at its site in Macclesfield, England. In September 2025, AstraZeneca paused a further £200 million research expansion in Cambridge, with the company's chief executive Pascal Soriot telling investors that the
AstraZeneca was actually one of the COVID-19 vaccine alternatives. AstraZeneca came a little bit later, but yeah, they had their own vaccine too.
United Kingdom, the company's own home market was, quote, increasingly ruled out for new investment, while AstraZeneca committed $50 billion of new spending to the United States through 2030. In April 2025, Ringworth, the last functioning crude oil refinery in Scotland, shut down its primary processing units after 100 years of operation, eliminating 400 direct jobs and leaving Scotland dependent on imported refined fuel. In September 2024, the Indian-owned Tata Steel plant at Port Talbot in South Wales closed its last blast furnace, ending more than a century of primary steel production in Wales and ending primary steel production in Britain, the country that invented the modern steel industry in the 1850s, whose Bessemer converter changed the course of the Industrial Revolution, is now the only major economy on Earth that cannot produce new steel from iron ore, while Germany runs 8 hydrogen-based green steel projects under construction. France 3, Spain 2, and the United Kingdom 0. As British manufacturing quietly folds, the London Stock Exchange, one of the most important securities markets in Europe, has been bleeding its largest companies to New York. The London Stock Exchange hosted just 18 initial public offerings in 2024, the lowest total since modern records began in 2010, and Flutter Entertainment moved its primary listing to New York after a 98% shareholder vote. CRH, the $75 billion building materials company, moved to New York. Ferguson moved to New York. As of late 2025, Shell, the Anglo-Dutch oil giant that has traded in London since the 1890s, has publicly confirmed it is considering a move to the New York Stock Exchange as well. While the top of the British economy was walking out the front door, the middle of the British economy was being quietly squeezed by housing, since Britain has the most.
So this also goes to my point earlier about how United States is very central to the world economy. Been looking. Hello. Let's talk about. I'm talking about economics while I do my day trading. Since my trading method is better, and I have a viewer that likes seeing me talk, so I decided to approach things this way, and I find fun actually. But yes, this isn't why the world's ending, world won't end. United States is very still central to the economic engine to the world.
Most expensive housing.
It just likely won't be as strong as we've seen in the past. This won't be as choice, but something will happen.
Market in the developed world relative to local wages. The average British house costs 7.6 times the average British salary in 2025, nearly double the long-run average of 3.9 times earnings that held through most of the 20th century, rising to 25.2 times earnings in London, in the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. An ordinary first-time buyer putting down a standard 20% deposit now spends 36% of take-home pay every single month on the mortgage alone, before food, transport, utilities, childcare, or taxes. British home ownership peaked at 71% in 2003 and had fallen to 63% by 2024, with the collapse concentrated on the 25 to 34 age group, meaning the core family-forming, career-building generation where home ownership crashed from 55% in 1990 to just 31% in 2023, locked more than half a generation of young Britons out of property ownership. The cause wasn't shortage of land, since Britain remains only 8.7% developed according to official land use surveys, but a shortage of permission to build. British runs on a planning system first designed by the Town and County Planning Act of 1947, in which every new building requires individual discretionary approval from the local council, which means every new building can be individually blocked by existing neighbors. 12.6 of England is officially classified as green belt and cannot be built on, while thousands more acres are blocked by local objections, nitrate pollution rules, and other protective regulations that successive governments have layered on top of the original 1947 framework. The consequences are visible and sometimes absurd. In March 2024, the local council in the London borough of Wandsworth rejected a proposal from the British house builder Barratt for 449 new apartments over concern.
It's easy to fall for the journalism waivers. Yeah, I'm hoping that's my goal. Like I've been saying, this town's really bad. Like, UK still exists. So like United States, there's like a lot of issues with the United States, but it'll still exist, just like all these other mass occurrences. We'll come from the ashes just like before. I just wish they would admit the issue sooner, but some invisible hand will force their hand on the way to address this issue.
That one of the buildings would stand 5 stories tall. In central England, the new HS2 high-speed rail project, already the most expensive rail project in European history, required the construction of a full kilometer-long steel mesh tunnel at a place called Sheephouse Wood to protect a colony of Bechstein's bats, an enclosure that cost £100 million and required 8,276 separate regulatory approvals before construction could begin. A proposed new nuclear power plant at Wilfaw in North Wales was delayed for years over concerns about Arctic terns, which are seabirds. A proposed new theme park on the Swanscombe Peninsula east of London was killed outright in 2024 by the discovery of a population of rare jumping spiders on the site. In the American state of Texas, meanwhile, the city of Austin added 120,000 new housing units in just 9 years between 2015 and 2024, growing the city's total housing stock by 30% and driving median rents down 16 to 22% from their 2021 peak. Texas as a whole permitted 133,549 new housing units in 2024, and Dallas-Fort Worth alone permitted 71,788, which is roughly the same number as Britain's entire housing production in many recent years. Austin isn't a utopia, since median home prices still exceeded $500,000, but Austin built its way out of its housing crisis.
See, like little data share right here, United States is still producing. I mean, it's not like it's going to caveman days overnight. It's just a problem that we need to learn to confront. They're trying to avoid it, but eventually we will need to confront the problems. It's like what came out of the 2008 crisis. We finally confronted the problems and we came out better. Let's read it.
Well, Britain chose not to build at all. At the back of the British housing system sits the quietest and most politically awkward part of the whole picture, which is social housing, meaning council flats,
Hey,
which
I'm gonna
also
pause
means
this.
government-owned.
I gotta eat something. Let me close this trade and I'll be AFK for a moment. Okay, now hit play in.
Apartments let at rents well below market rates. Roughly 4.3 million social housing units exist in London, home to about 1 in 6 British households, and they were originally designed as a temporary stepping stone, a safety net to catch low-income families on their way to private ownership or private rental. But in practice, they have become something very different. About 45% of social rented households have stayed in exactly the same property for more than 10 years, against the 15% in the private rental market. In 2024 and 2025, only about 6% of England's 4.3 million social housing properties became available to new tenants through the entire year, with London's annual churn rate at just 2.7%, while 78% of all new social housing tenancies granted in the last year were lifetime tenancies, meaning once the tenant moves in, the tenant has the legal right to stay forever, pass the tenancy to family members in some cases, and face eviction only in narrow circumstances such as criminal behavior or rent default. And the effect on the labor market is severe. A council flat in inner London rented at perhaps £120 a week, when the equivalent private market rent might be £500 a week, represents an effective subsidy worth roughly £20,000 a year, tax-free indefinitely, and the subsidy only exists if the tenant stays in that specific property. A social housing tenant who gets a job offer in Manchester cannot take the council flat with them, so the tenant often turns down the job. Meanwhile, 1.34 million households sit on local council waiting lists in England, with 165,000 British children living in temporary accommodation, which is government speak for bed and breakfast rooms, emergency hostels, and short-term motels. 32 local authorities report average waiting times of more than 18 years for a social housing property, and 3 London boroughs at current allocation rates have mathematically waiting times of more than 100 years. One generation of British families stays in council flats indefinitely because the incentive is overwhelming, while the next generation waits outside year after year because the only way the inside family ever leaves is funeral or prison. The deeper problem is that the British welfare system has stopped rewarding work. In modern Britain, a single parent with 2 children in council housing who moves from a £20,000 a year job to a £30,000 a year job will see most of the additional £10,000 clawed back by a combination of reduced housing benefit, reduced universal credits, reduced childcare subsidies, and higher marginal income tax, producing an effective marginal tax rate on that extra £10,000 of earnings that can exceed 80% in the most extreme cases. The math of taking the new job is worse than the math of refusing it. And this same logic explains why the British economic inactivity rate, meaning the share of working age adults who are neither in work nor looking for work, has risen sharply since the COVID-19 pandemic, with roughly 2.8 million Britons on long-term sickness benefits, a number that continues to grow every month despite repeated government attempts to tighten eligibility. The British state now spends more on working age welfare payments every year than it collects in income tax.
Because life moves on, I'm wondering if people really appreciate what the COVID-19 situation has done and led to the economy, like businesses in general. What less of a workforce, because less people means more profits, and of course that's coming in conjunction with AI. See how more than one situation comes together often? What's that? Limit to one thing.
Because no government can cancel those benefits without triggering riots, and no government can raise the taxes to pay for them without driving out the remaining high earners, so the state simply borrows the difference. This is why the British national debt sits at 93% of GDP, and why, across 36 advanced economies analyzed by the International Monetary Fund, the United Kingdom currently carries the 5th highest government deficit as a share of GDP.
See? Besides GDP, no United States here. There's Japan. Calvin, Barnley, and I think it's close to 2000. I thought too. I wonder how much that is updated. I'm not sure what this metric is because of that, 100%. Because the United States is like higher to 8%. So this might be slightly different metric.
The third highest government borrowing cost and the sixth highest debt ratio simultaneously. Britain now ranks among the most indebted, most expensive to lend to, and the most fiscally fragile large economies in the wealthy world. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the official British government fiscal watchdog, has warned that the British financial position is, quote, increasingly vulnerable by historical and international standards. Everyone who looks at the numbers knows it. The British political class has decided not to tell the British public. And clearly, they should be telling the British public. That is the issue here. One thing they could tell the British public right now, for example, is that if you sign up for a Chime checking account with my link and only my link, you will get literally $200 for free. It's not a scam. That's not some weird misspelling in my script. Nothing like that. It's actually $200 for free. But why would they give that to you? It seems weird. I know. But it's not. Think about it. I get free money because you sign up. You get free money because you sign up.
Done it again. Next smooth transition.
Why do they do that for both of us? Because they get you to use their platform. And it's a good platform with a nation-leading high-yield savings rate. You can use the bank anywhere. It's actually incredible to manage your money. So just check it out. Sign up, connect direct deposit, and literally get $200 right now just for signing up at chime.com/Caleb or link in the description below. In return for all of that tax and all of that debt, the British public is getting increasingly less. The National Health Service is the closest thing Britain has to a national religion. Yet, in 2025, the waiting list for NHS treatment in England sat at 7.25 million people, down from the all-time peak of 7.77 million in September 2023, but still roughly 1 in every 9 adults in the entire country. The median wait for elective treatment is 13.6 weeks, compared to 7.8 weeks in 2019. Britain's 5-year survival rate for colon cancer, 60%, is the second lowest of the 18 wealthy countries tracked by Cancer Research UK, which estimates that British cancer survival now lags the leading countries by 10 to 15 years. British life expectancy stalled completely around 2011, well before COVID-19. NHS productivity sits 5% to 11% below 2019 levels, despite record high headcounts, with the total doctor workforce up 47% since 2015. In April 2026, British resident doctors, formerly called junior doctors, went on a 6-day strike over pay, with the British Medical Association claiming that real resident doctor pay in 2026 is 21% lower than in 2008. The Health Foundation estimates that roughly £20 billion a year of NHS spending is lost to inefficiency, duplication,
It's not my bad.
and administrative bloat. All of it is the single most politically
Green
explosive
Cat 90
effort
just
in
joined the
modern
Magic
day,
Fox
which is
cult.
immigration.
Yay!
In the 12 months
I
ending
need more
March
music.
2023, the Office for National Statistics recorded 944,000 people of net immigration to the United Kingdom.
But
roughly
yeah, we're
3
talking
times
about- I'm talking about Britain. Britain's economic-wide play is what choosing on turn off. I keep on touching. I keep touching it. Actually, keep touching it. It's nice little white noise as we watch the economic stuff. But anyway, I was gonna say, real fix on Medicare, and low rates can increase too. You'll see. Features unknown.
Pre-Brexit average and roughly equivalent to adding the entire population of Glasgow in a single year. Cumulative net immigration between 2021 and 2024 reached 2.55 million people, or 3.8% of the entire British population in just 4 years, the single largest demographic shift in any peacetime period of British history. While aggregate British GDP grew because there were simply more people in the country spending money, British GDP per person, which is the measure that actually determines how rich the average British citizen is, went sideways or down. The arithmetic was brutally simple, since each new arrival required housing, healthcare, and a school place for their children. And Britain, with its frozen planning system and its underfunded public services and its stagnant productivity, could not supply any of those things at the scale required. The Center for Policy Studies estimates that net immigration accounted for roughly 89% of the 1.34 million increase in England's housing deficit over the last decade, with 67% of private rented households in London now headed by someone born outside of the UK. Under combined political pressure from both the right and the left, British net migration has since collapsed. Net migration fell to 204,000 in the 12 months ending June 2025, a two-thirds drop in 1 year, while health and care worker visas, which had hit 145,820.
People still want to immigrate here, so there's that. Some people live here.
In 2023 alone, collapsed 81% to just 27,174 by 2024 after the government banned dependents from the route. For the first time in decades, immigration of native British citizens now exceeds immigration of British citizens returning home, meaning the United Kingdom is now, on net, losing British people. The damage to the British social contract has already been done. However, since immigration has overtaken the cost of living, the National Health Service, and the economy as the single most important political issue, for 51% of Britons in Ipsos polling, and 45% of British respondents now tell pollsters the United Kingdom should admit no more migrants at all, and should require large numbers of those who arrived recently to leave. Reform UK, the populist insurgent party led by Nigel Farage, who had spent 30 years campaigning first for Brexit and then for radical immigration restriction, polled 14.3% of the vote in July 2024 and won only 5 parliamentary seats under Britain's first past-the-post electoral system. By April 2026, in YouGov polling, Reform...
So what's your thoughts on this? The United States might see something similar as they correct their debt issues. I wonder if Great Britain will be able to reverse its downfall. It survived it, but thriving and surviving are two different things. I think it's definitely a possibility. Listen from bleak friend. For they bring I feel bad for that. I feel bad too. I feel bad for people in America too. There's a lot of people that live paycheck. I feel sorry for people that can't budget, and unhappy people like Caleb actually exist to try to help people directly. managing their
The
budget.
UK sat at 24%, ahead of the Conservatives at 19%, the Labour Party at 16%, the Greens at 16%, and the Liberal Democrats at 13%. Chancellor Rachel Reeves recorded a net favorability rating of -51, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer recorded -58. The two-party political system that has governed the United Kingdom since the Second World War is cracking apart under the weight of accumulated public frustration, and the party rising fastest is one promising the most radical departure from the status quo. Public trust in the existing British state has collapsed across almost every measure. In September 2024, just weeks after taking office, Starmer became embroiled in a gift scandal involving roughly £100,000 of undeclared gifts from a Labour donor named Wahid Ali, including £5,000 of clothes purchased for the Prime Minister's wife, Victoria Starmer, and Starmer's net approval rating dropped.
It's funny hearing it worded that way. It's like 500 pounds of clothes or whatever you said. I tell you, miss it. But it's like, yeah, tell it to American. They would actually think that's the actual like weight of it, not money currency.
45 points in a matter of weeks. The farmers' inheritance tax revolt, which began in November 2024 when the tractors rolled down Whitehall past Downing Street, produced the largest on-street protest against a Labour government since it took office. In July 2025, the government U-turned on cuts to the winter fuel payment for pensioners. Every one of these U-turns narrowed the fiscal headroom of the government that made them. Hovering over every decision is the trust shock, the September 2022 episode in which Prime Minister Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng attempted to push through £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts, only to trigger a full-blown gilt market crisis that forced the Bank of England to an emergency £19.3 billion.
How do tax cuts weigh that much? What the frick?
Bond buying intervention crashed British pension funds by £425 billion in 72 hours and ended Truss's premiership after just 49 days. The Daily Star tabloid had live-streamed a single head of lettuce next to a framed photograph of Truss for the duration of her premiership.
Oh, yeah, here's the thing I was talking about earlier. This is funny. The head of lettuce.
Asking viewers to vote on which would last longer, and the lettuce eventually outlasted the Prime Minister. The painful irony is that nearly everyone involved in running modern Britain agrees on what the country needs to do, because the diagnosis isn't contested. The country requires far more houses, dramatically cheaper energy, lower marginal tax rates on its most productive workers, a working planning system, a working apprenticeship system, retention of its best doctors and engineers and entrepreneurs, and reform of a welfare state that has drifted into paying more people not to work. The Institute of Economic Affairs survey that started this story, the same one that found 87% of Britons want more economic growth, also found 77% supporting lower energy costs, 72% supporting lower taxes on workers, and 59% supporting the easing of planning restrictions, while support of higher taxes and higher spending, which had surged during the pandemic, has fallen to 36%, the lowest share since 2013. The British public is openly asking for supply-side reform, and the British political class has so far failed to deliver it. Both major British parties, Labour and Conservative, now have leaders who approval ratings sit in negative territory so deep that neither can credibly claim a mandate for the painful decisions that reform would actually require. The numbers going forward do not offer much comfort. The International Monetary Fund's April 2026 spring meetings cut Britain's 2026 growth forecast to 0.8%, the sharpest single downgrade of any G7 economy, while the Office for Budget Responsibility projects British public debt rising to roughly 96.5% of GDP by 2028 to 2029 before easing, with debt interest climbing from £111 billion this year to £137 billion by 2030. The long-run OBR projection before any adjustments for future policy changes shows British debt reaching 275% of GDP by the 27th.
See, United States is not the only one that has doomed projections based on current trends. See, this is just as bad, if not worse. They're slightly better than us right now, but that can easily change. unlike the United States, we actually have real production backing up our debt. This is something else.
Companies under central assumptions and 325% of GDP under stress scenarios. The Center for Economics and British Research forecasts that total British GDP will still grow from roughly $4 trillion in the mid-2020s to $6.8 trillion by 2040, which in raw aggregate terms would keep Britain as the fifth largest economy in the world. But the per-person GDP ranking is forecast to slide continuously through the 2030s, dropping from 19th place globally to the low 20s by 2040. Britain will remain a big economy while continuing to fall as an individually rich economy, with the scale of the pie preserved and the substance of each slice draining out. Many British economic commentators now describe where the country is headed as a poor big country, meaning a nation with enormous aggregate output on paper and stagnant living standards on the ground, whose citizens will continue reading news articles describing Britain as the fifth largest economy on Earth while personally earning less in real terms than their parents did at the same age, and watching Mississippi pull further and further ahead on the simple measure of how much the average worker actually produces in a single hour of effort. A story that began on April 13th, 2026 with the release of a single survey by a London think tank is not really a story about Mississippi. Mississippi is the punchline, the comparison that finally made the British editors pay attention. The real story is the quarter century of slow, compounding choices that took a country with an empire, a navy, a global reserve currency, and
Yeah, the thing to remember, it's less about Mississippi and more about how such a global superpower, if it's incorporated as a state, we look toward Mississippi by metrics. So,
manufacturing base, the largest financial center in Europe, and the second highest income per person in the entire Western world, and converted it one planning rejection at a time, one tax rise at a time, one shuttered factory at a time, one departing millionaire at a time, one immigrating young doctor at a time, into a fiscally fragile, structurally stagnant, high tax, low growth, energy poor, housing starved economy that can no longer keep its own talent from boarding planes to Sydney, Dubai, Toronto, and to Texas. The Institute of Economic Affairs survey found that 9% of Britons still believe their country is wealthy enough, while 70% expect the economy to get worse. The distance between those two numbers, between the country Britons think they live in and the country they actually live in, is the distance between a rich nation and a declining nation, between a confident nation and a frightened nation, between a nation that still believes it ran the world within living memory and a nation that has just discovered in cold black print on an April Monday in 2026 that on the single metric that matters most for how much money the average citizen actually brings home every month, the United Kingdom has been outperformed by every single one of the 50 American states, including the ones Americans have spent 150 years making jokes about. So unless British government finds the political courage to liberalize planning, reduce marginalized tax rates on skilled workers, deliver cheap, reliable energy, stop losing its listed companies to New York, retain its young doctors and engineers and wealthy taxpayers, and rebuild the supply side of the economy that was gradually dismantled over 25 years of political drift, the gap will not close. The gap will widen, with Mississippi pulling further ahead, Alabama pulling further ahead, Arkansas pulling further ahead, and West Virginia pulling further ahead. A story released in London on April 13th, 2026, as a shocking survey result will become, in another 10 years, the ordinary way economists describe the country that used to be Great Britain. A country that once ruled the world has become, quietly and almost accidentally, poorer than every single state of the country that used to be its colony.
And here's a real punchline. It used to be, the area that used to be its colony, it's now poor, that one its colonies.
I'll be candid. Front Page loses money. The cost of research, audio editing,
So, But like I said, it's still the fifth world's largest economy. It still exists, but just and I lost $2. Oh, wait, one man. Where's that $4? Yeah. Let's try to mix it up. I might just say people still want to mine right there. No, I was actually making a comparison to the United States more than them. They're from my understanding, they're more of a net loss. People are leaving more than coming in. But like the United States, there's issues in the United States as in people are still immigrating in, so can't be that bad. And Great Britain is still the fifth world's largest economy. So it has problems, but it still has reasons to thrive at the same time. Yeah, it's myself for not being fair. No, I got it. There we go. We made up that maps. I punched in the wrong number, so I lost a little bit of money. When you're doing the same thing for 8 hours, there's gonna be a slip up here and there. But at the same time, you gotta appreciate how things can change. The world superpower, the empire that had everything, where you could say the sun never set, is now poorer than Mississippi with an individual comparison basis. So this is why investing in individual companies is also risky. That's why I suggested world ETFs and stuff like that, because these can change real quickly, and individual companies too, like that. So take Blockbuster for example, it's king in the world. Yeah, you wanna know the irony is? Netflix actually approached Blockbuster about buying them out. Now who owns the world? Who has last left from them? Yeah, it's Google. Google had an offer to be bought out by Yahoo. Yahoo turned them down. there's that as well. Yeah. Kodak used to rule the film industry, like taking pictures. And they even actually invented the technology for digital cameras. But the CEO said, no digital camera, no. We want to make money off of film. Like how you can process the film, you process the image. And they're like, no, we want to make money off the image, so we're not gonna go digital. So eventually the world leapfrogged them. And the film was their valuation. You can even ask a question along these lines. What's the world's 10 largest companies in 1980, for example? Or where do those top 10 largest companies stand now? Yeah. Will the top 10 largest companies today still be top 10 in 20 or 30 years? Well, maybe a Soviet juggernaut like it is. We do not know. Yep, exactly. Yeah, Kodak learned that the hard way, didn't they? Kodak and, Blockbuster. Yeah, with Blockbuster specifically, I still remember going to a Blockbuster store, sticking my Nintendo, what do you call it, Nintendo 64 memory cards, and have it print out Pokemon Snap pictures as stickers. This is insane. So, what's up with you? What are you doing? It's kinda late for another video because we will be able to finish it. But today is definitely a bit fun like yesterday.